Don't trust the sheriff. A dog's memory never lies. Mara was used to being told what not to ask. Don't talk about the shed, don't mention the camp, and above all, don't go near the woods after dark. But after a stranger was spotted, limping through the trees, followed by a scarred German shepherd who never barked, something in her shifted. That night, she found a note, a photograph, and a name. Trent. It was the same name her mother had whispered in her sleep, before she disappeared for good. Most dogs forget after a while. Asher never did. This isn't a story about ghosts. It's about justice, loyalty, and what happens when a town turns its back on the truth but a dog refuses to. The rain hadn't stopped for hours. It wasn't the kind of soft drizzle that sang on rooftops this storm bore weight. Thick, cold sheets fell from a sky the color of wet ash, beating down on the slanted tin roof of the old cabin at the edge of Elderglen. The town, tucked into a forgotten valley where cell signals vanished and pine trees outnumbered people, seemed to disappear into the mist that hung low and heavy. Mara sat cross-legged by the window, her small hand pressed to the cold glass. The pane vibrated faintly beneath her fingertips, a trembling that came not just from the storm, but from something quieter, something watching. She didn't speak it aloud. She never did. Outside, her father, Ewan, was hunched beneath a battered green raincoat, nailing a wooden board over the shed window. The storm had torn the latch loose again. His shoulders moved with the slow resolve of someone used to holding things together with too little. He didn't look up once. The wind howled down from the tree line, like a warning or maybe a memory. Mara watched the forest. The trees swayed violently, the tips of the evergreens bending as if in pain. Beyond them, where the woods grew darker, deeper, her gaze always stopped there, even during daylight. But today, in the storm, that edge seemed to breathe. Something was out there. Something had always been out there. Her mother used to say the forest carried stories. "Listen close," she'd whisper, brushing Mara's damp hair away from her forehead. "And you'll hear things the wind doesn't want you to know." That was before the silence moved in, before the nights got longer, before the last time her mother walked into the woods and never came back. Ewan never talked about it, not once. Not when the search teams gave up. Not when the police declared it unresolved. Not even when Mara found her mother's scarf days later caught in the branches like it had been hung there deliberately. They had buried no body, only the idea of her. And even that never stayed buried long. Now, the house held on to her absence, like an echo. It lingered in the spaces between breaths, in the soft hush after a door creaked shut, in the way Ewan avoided the woods entirely. Their grief wasn't loud. It had settled into the walls, the floorboards, the routines. And Mara, 10 years old and too old in the eyes, knew better than to ask questions that didn't have answers. She curled deeper into her oversized flannel sweater, worn soft from her mother's closet, and squinted through the window again. The shed creaked as Ewan finished his repairs. He wiped his brow and stared into the woods for a moment too long, that pause where you're not looking at something, but through it. Then he turned and trudged back to the house. Mara heard the boots on the porch steps, the clatter of the door unlatching. He stepped in, soaked and wordless, hanging the coat by the stove. "Storm's picked up," he muttered. His voice was sandpaper and pine. She nodded, still by the window. "I know." He glanced toward her. There was tenderness in his eyes, always. But behind it a weight he never dropped. The kind that turned smiles into half-attempts. "You hungry?" She shook her head. He didn't press, just moved to the stove, lighting it with a practiced flick. The flame crackled to life, casting a warm, amber glow across the cabin. The smell of cedar and wet earth crept in through the door he hadn't fully shut. Ewan stirred a pot of something simple, likely stew. Mara stayed by the window, watching, listening. That feeling hadn't left. It clung to her skin like the rain on the glass. Suddenly, the porch light flickered. Once, twice, then out. Mara's breath hitched. She turned toward her father. "Did you see?" But he was already moving, grabbing the flashlight from the shelf near the door. "Probably the wind again," he said, but there was something tight in his jaw. He opened the door and paused. The forest beyond was pitch. Only the rain moved. Only the trees whispered, but Mara's eyes were fixed on something else. At the edge of the woods, Just beyond the final row of pine trunks, a shadow stood unmoving, soaked, but unmistakably a dog. It wasn't fear that flooded her. It was something else. Recognition. Though she'd never seen him before, her heart knew something her mind didn't. He was battered, ribs showing beneath fur matted with mud. One ear drooped at the tip, and his eyes, oh, his eyes, they were amber, like leaves in autumn firelight, and they were staring straight at her. Not her father, not the house, her. The moment stretched. The storm howled louder. Yet in that instant, the world held its breath. Then the dog turned, limped forward once, then collapsed in the mud. Mara was out the door before her father could call her name. She didn't hesitate, didn't ask why. She just knew. The ground was slick beneath her boots. Rain soaked her sweater, her hair plastered to her forehead. But all she saw was the unmoving shape in the grass. She knelt beside him, trembling hands reaching gently. "Hey," she whispered, "it's okay." He didn't growl, didn't flinch, just opened his eyes again and let out a sound that wasn't a whine, wasn't a growl, but something in between. Something old, something tired. Ewan reached them seconds later, flashlight beam cutting through the dark. "Mara, he's hurt," she said, not looking back. "We can't leave him." Ewan stared at the dog, then at the trees. Then he nodded, and in the rain-soaked quiet, beneath a sky heavy with secrets, a girl and a dog looked at each other, as if they had waited their whole lives for this exact moment. And maybe, just maybe, they had. The rain had thinned overnight, but its echo lingered a soft hiss on the cabin's tin roof, the earth still heavy with water. Morning light filtered through gray clouds, pale and cold. Inside, the fire had died down, leaving only the faint scent of pine ash. Mara stirred quietly. She slipped from her bed without waking her father. Her bare feet touched the chilled wooden floor, but she didn't flinch. Something had woken her. Not sound, not dream. A pull. She padded to the back door and opened it carefully, the creak of the hinges muffled by the wet hush outside. Beyond the steps, the world was still. Trees stood like watchers wrapped in mist. The scent of damp earth and something else, something metallic, touched her nose. She blinked. That's when she saw it. The fence. The rear panel of their old wooden fence, the one bordering the woods, had collapsed inward, like something large had forced its way through. Splinters jutted from the posts, and one horizontal plank hung at an angle, half torn. Mud had been churned at the base as if someone, or something, had scrambled and struggled there. Mara's heart thudded once. She stepped off the porch slowly, each footfall squelching in the mud. Her breath made little clouds in the morning air. She knelt near the broken fence and studied the prints. Some were broad and boot-shaped, her father's, maybe, but others were newer, uneven, lighter but erratic, like someone barefoot had run through in the night. Then she saw them. Paw prints. Deep, wide-set, German shepherd size. She stood, followed. The woods behind the cabin weren't particularly dense, but after a night of rain, they held a hushed weight. Leaves dripped, branches sagged. Crows watched from blackened perches, but made no sound. The footprints were fresher here, pressed into soaked moss and fallen pine needles. The dog, if it was a dog, hadn't gone far. And then she heard it. A faint rustle, a low whine. She turned left, stepping over a moss-covered log, and gasped. There, tangled in the underbrush, was a German shepherd, mud-caked, soaked through, and shaking. His coat, once black and tan, was now a mottled mess of earth and blood. Brambles clung to his fur like thorns to memory. One of his hind legs was twisted awkwardly beneath him, and dried leaves clung to his ear. He lifted his head weakly at her approach, but didn't growl, just stared. Mara froze, not in fear, but in awe. She had seen German shepherds in books, on television, once or twice at the town fair. But this one, there was something different. His eyes were amber, not brown, sharp, tired, and too knowing. There was a sadness in them, a depth she couldn't name. "You're hurt," she whispered, as if any louder might break the air around them. The dog gave a soft huff, almost a sigh. His chest rose and fell quickly. Mara moved closer, slowly, crouching so he could see her hands. "It's okay. I won't hurt you." "Sen, One hand reached forward. The dog flinched. She paused, waited, then tried again, letting her fingers brush against a thorny vine near his neck. She worked carefully, freeing one bramble at a time, whispering softly all the while, like her mother used to do when Mara got sick. Old words, gentle ones, words that didn't mean much except to say, "You're safe now." The dog didn't fight. He watched, and when her hands reached his chest, his eyes closed. "There," she murmured, tugging the last vine free. "You're not just a stray, are you?" As if in response, he gave a barely audible groan. Not pain, but something heavier. Grief. Exhaustion. Under the mud, his fur was patchy in places, revealing healed-over scars, straight, deliberate ones. Not the kind you get from living in the wild, but the kind left by man. Tools. Training. Mara blinked hard. Something about him didn't feel accidental. Like he hadn't ended up here by chance. A breeze stirred the trees above. The smell of smoke, faint and distant, curled into her nose. "Where did you come from?" she asked. The dog didn't answer, of course, but his eyes opened. And in that gaze, for a split second, she saw something strange recognition. Like he'd been looking for someone. Like he'd found her. Mara stood and took a hesitant step back. "Can you walk?" He tried, struggled, collapsed. "No. No, don't," she said quickly, kneeling again. "We'll get help. My dad, he'll know what to do." She hesitated at that. Would her father let her keep him? He'd been so careful since Mom died, so protective. She wasn't even allowed near the highway. And yet here she was, knee-deep in brambles, talking to a stray dog like he was some war hero. But her gut told her this mattered. She couldn't leave him. So she wrapped her arms around his chest, careful, slow, and leaned her weight back to pull him free. He whimpered once, then rested his head against her shoulder. He didn't resist. It took all her strength to drag him through the woods. By the time they reached the cabin's back steps, her arms trembled and her clothes were soaked. Her knees were scraped, and mud coated her palms. But the dog didn't take his eyes off her. The woodshed had not seen life in months. Cobwebs lined the corners like time's forgotten stitching, and the scent of old cedar clung to the damp air. Mara pushed the door open with both hands, her breath hitching in her chest as the rusty hinges gave a groan. The German shepherd, still nameless, still soaked and trembling, stood just outside the threshold, hesitating like a soldier returning to a battlefield he'd barely escaped. "He'll stay here," Mara said, her voice firmer than a 10-year-old should be. Ewan crossed his arms, boots still wet from the field. Rain dripped from the brim of his hat, darkening the porch planks at his feet. His jaw clenched, but he didn't argue. "He can't stay forever, Mara." "I know." But she didn't mean it. "Not really." With a nod from her father, less approval than surrender, Mara turned back and knelt beside the dog. He didn't flinch. His fur, matted and thick with burrs, held the weight of 100 storms. His eyes, though, they were something else entirely. Not wild, not afraid, just watching. Like he'd already lived this moment once before. She whispered as she guided him in. "It's not much, but it's dry." The dog stepped inside. Not quickly, not with the eagerness of a stray offered warmth. He moved like a ghost walking into a memory. With each step, he scanned the shadows, the corners, the rafters, the open cracks near the roof, like somewhere inside him. Instinct still lived. Something trained. Something wounded. Mara placed a folded flannel on a wooden pallet, then stepped back. He circled once, twice, then, slowly, lowered himself onto it with a tired grunt. She sat near him on the cold floor, knees hugged to her chest, listening to the soft patter of rain now easing into drizzle. "I don't think you got lost," she murmured, her gaze fixed on the dark line of scars along his ribs. "You were running from something, or maybe toward someone." The dog didn't respond, of course, but his ear twitched. She reached a hand toward him, cautious, open. He didn't lick, didn't pull away, just pressed his chin lightly into her palm as if to say, "I see you too." For a long moment, neither of them moved. In the distance, a crow cawed from the edge of the forest, a sound like a warning or a memory. By evening, the woodshed had gone quiet. Ewan stayed inside the house, nursing a chipped mug of black coffee, eyes flicking between the living room window and the old clock on the wall. Time moved slow in Elderglen, slower still in the rain, but that night, it felt frozen. When Mara returned inside, cheeks red from the chill, he didn't ask questions, just handed her a towel and watched her disappear down the hallway to her room. He wanted to believe it was just a stray. A dog, no matter how smart, was still just a dog. But something in the way it moved alert without panic, still without submission, made the soldier in him uneasy. That night, Mara couldn't sleep. Wind rustled the trees outside, brushing branches like fingers against her window pane. The storm had passed, but a weight still hung in the air, like the moment before thunder, when the world holds its breath. She tiptoed to the door, pulled it open just enough to peek into the hallway. The floor creaked beneath her socks. She padded past the kitchen, past the quiet living room where her father had dozed off with the television still flickering in gray-blue tones. The back door opened with a sigh. Outside, the sky was clearing. Mist hung low, and the earth smelled like wet pine and rust. The woodshed stood still under the starlight. But the dog wasn't inside anymore. Mara's breath caught in her throat. Then she saw him. He was lying on the doormat just outside the house, head upright, body still, facing the dark line where the backyard met the woods. His ears perked. His gaze didn't waver, guarding. She moved closer, her feet barely making a sound on the grass. As if sensing her presence, he shifted slightly, glancing at her, not startled, not scolding, just aware. "You didn't leave." He blinked once. She sat beside him, shoulder to fur, wrapping her arms around her knees again. "What are you waiting for?" she asked. The dog didn't answer, but his eyes flicked toward the woods, deep into the trees where no light reached, toward something neither of them could name. And then, slowly, his body relaxed, not fully, but enough to lie down, still watching, still listening. It was a silent understanding, one that didn't need words, one older than fear, older than grief. She had found him, or maybe he had found her. Either way, something had changed. In the house behind them, a single lamp glowed faintly in the window, and out in the trees, far beyond where the dog's eyes were fixed, something else was watching back. The morning came muffled in mist. The rain had paused, leaving a hush in its wake as though the world was holding its breath. Ewan didn't wake Mara. He simply left a note on the table beside her half-finished drawing of the dog. The truck rumbled to life like it hadn't in days. Asher lay curled in the bed of it, swaddled in a faded army blanket Ewan hadn't unfolded since the day they buried his wife. The dog didn't resist. He hadn't barked once since Mara brought him home. He simply watched, always watching. The vet clinic sat at the edge of Elderglen's only paved road, next to an abandoned feed store and a rust-bitten mailbox filled with old flyers. Ewan hadn't seen Ingrid Adler in nearly a year, not since she closed early one afternoon and never reopened for days. People said it was grief, said it had something to do with her son who never came back from the war. When Ewan carried the dog inside, Ingrid didn't speak. She merely opened the door wider and nodded toward the back room, her hair streaked gray, hands still strong beneath blue gloves. "You don't do mornings," Ewan muttered, trying for casual. Ingrid didn't smile. "Not unless someone's bleeding." Asher didn't flinch when she touched him. She worked gently, lifting a paw, parting fur, her fingers moving with quiet precision honed by years of practice and personal loss. Mud flaked from his belly, dried blood crusted one hind leg. A gash along his shoulder spoke of a fight or escape. "He's underweight," she murmured. "But that's not what you brought him in for." Ewan said nothing. He watched the way she slowed near the left ear, how her eyes narrowed at something only she saw. A pause. Then her voice dropped soft as fog. "You see this?" She turned the dog's head gently, exposing the underside of his left ear. A thin series of numbers, barely visible through the scar tissue, shimmered under the overhead light. Tattooed ID, military format. Ewan frowned. "You're sure?" "I've seen it before. These markings, this isn't some hunter's dog who got lost. This is a trained K9, government, possibly Black Ops." The word hung there, foreign and cold. She stepped back, removed her gloves. Her hands trembled slightly. "Can you trace it?" "I tried already." She motioned toward her laptop in the corner. "No records in the federal or state database. Not in the civilian K-9 units either. It's like he doesn't exist." Ewan felt a heaviness settle between his shoulders. Not fear exactly, but something akin to responsibility. "What does that mean?" Ingrid met his eyes. "It means someone went to a lot of trouble to erase him." They both looked down at the dog. He was lying still on the table, watching them. Not tense, not relaxed, just present. "He hasn't barked once," Ewan said after a moment. "Not even a growl. But he follows Mara like he's sworn to protect her." Ingrid nodded slowly, a quiet recognition behind her eyes. "They're trained that way. Deep bond imprinting to one handler. But if something happens to that handler..." She didn't finish. She didn't need to. The room fell quiet except for the tick of a wall clock and the distant call of crows. "I won't tell her yet," Ewan said, almost to himself. "Why not?" "Because I don't know what I'd be telling her." He glanced at the dog again. "Not until I understand who he is. Or who he was." Ingrid moved to the cabinet, scribbled something on a small label, and handed him a bottle of antibiotics. "For the shoulder wound, twice a day with food." He nodded, took the bottle, but as he turned to leave, she placed a hand lightly on his arm. "Ewan, be careful." He looked at her, unsure what she meant, unsure if she even knew herself. "He's not dangerous," he said. Ingrid's gaze flicked to the window, where mist curled against the glass. "Number. But whatever he ran from might be." Outside, the fog had thickened. Asher padded beside Ewan without a sound, his steps measured, precise as though muscle memory, not will, was guiding him. As they drove home, Ewan kept glancing at the rearview mirror, not at the road behind. At the dog whose eyes never blinked, never turned. They were fixed forward, toward the road ahead, like he already knew where they were going, or worse, who might be coming. The rain had passed. A pale, wet sun slid over Elderglen like a tired apology. Morning light bled through the fogged windows of the cabin, casting soft lines across the hardwood floor. Mara sat cross-legged on the rug, flipping through one of her mother's old notebooks, the pages yellowed, the ink faded, but still carrying that soft lavender scent that hadn't aged. It had belonged to her mother, Leora, a midwife who wrote everything in cursive, who pressed dried flowers into margins and gave names to the wind. Mara didn't always understand the words, but she read them anyway. They felt like lullabies from a time before everything fell quiet. Today, a single word had stopped her. Asher. It was scrawled in a margin beside a list of herbs and symbols. Underneath, in her mother's soft looping hand, a share, blessed survivor. Outside, the dog lay curled just beneath the woodshed's awning, where the morning mist still hung like a veil. He had not left since the night Mara found him. Hadn't barked, hadn't whimpered. Just watched the world as if waiting for something to return. Or someone. She pushed the door open slowly and stepped barefoot onto the dew-wet planks. He lifted his head. There was a stillness to him, but not the kind that sleep brings. More like he held himself together by choice, like stillness was a kind of armor. His ears twitched, but his eyes, those weary, golden eyes, met hers without fear. Mara bent down, holding the notebook against her chest. "I found your name," she whispered, brushing her hair behind one ear. "Asher." The name hung in the morning air. He didn't move at first. Then, in a gesture so subtle it could have been missed, his tail gave the smallest twitch. Just once, but it was enough. Enough to make Mara smile, like something sacred had passed between them. "Asher," she repeated, softer now. "You don't have to be scared anymore." She reached toward him. He didn't flinch, but it was later, that evening, when the quiet trust they'd built was tested. The storm had left the air muggy and heavy. Mara, eager to help, had tried carrying a tray of leftover stew from the kitchen to the porch. But her hands were too small, too unsure. The glass bowl slipped, shattering across the wooden floor with a sharp, cruel crash. Asher jerked like a live wire. In a blink, his body tensed, eyes wide, tail curled under. Mara froze. It wasn't just fear. It was memory. He backed away from the shards, shoulders low, as though expecting pain. The hairs along his spine rose ever so slightly, not in aggression and terror. Not from this house, but from another time. Another place. The silence between them was loud, aching. Mara knelt down. Slowly. She didn't speak right away. She didn't reach for him. Instead, she began picking up the pieces of broken glass, one by one, letting the quiet stretch between them like a held breath. He stayed in the corner, eyes on her, chest rising fast and shallow. When the last piece was in the dustpan, she walked to the trash and emptied it. Then she came back, knees creaking gently against the wood, and sat on the floor the same way she had that morning, only now. The light had dimmed, and so had the distance between them. She didn't cry. She didn't say sorry. Instead, she opened her palms. "It's okay now," she whispered, voice catching like wind on a reed. "No one here is going to hurt you." He watched her. Every breath, every blink, his body still taut. One paw lifted like he wasn't sure if he could move without shattering. And then slowly he took one step forward, then another. Mara kept still. He stopped beside her and just stood there. Then, as if gravity had changed its mind, he lowered his body, curled close to her side, and placed his head gently onto her lap. Her hands moved to his fur, slow and deliberate. He didn't flinch this time. She stroked the side of his neck, feeling the roughness of old scars beneath soft fur. "I don't know who did that to you," she whispered, "but they don't get to keep you scared. Not here, not with me." Outside, the wind passed through the trees with a low sigh. The woodshed creaked. A bird, just one, gave a solitary cry before nesting deeper into the dark. And in that moment, the world felt very far away. Here was a girl who had lost too much, and a dog who had seen too much, and yet neither ran. They stayed. That night, Ewan found them both asleep on the porch, Mara's cheek resting on Asher's shoulder, his ears flicking at every sound, his body still alert, still guarding. But his eyes, even as he stayed awake, no longer held the wild glint of fear. He looked at peace, or at least the beginning of it. Ewan didn't wake them. He just stood there a moment longer, arms crossed, his face unreadable in the porch light. Then, with a quiet breath, he stepped back inside and left the door open just a crack enough for Asher to see the warm glow and for Mara to return inside if she wished. The cabin had never truly been whole since Leora passed. But that night, for the first time in months, it didn't feel empty. Not entirely. And outside, under the stars, a dog who now had a name kept watch, not out of duty, but devotion. The town of Elderglen was still shaking the sleep from its bones when Mara stepped onto the sidewalk, one hand clutching the coarse leash, the other deep in the pocket of her yellow coat. Asher padded beside her, his stride cautious, body close to hers, a silent shadow in tan and black. The morning sun hung low, its light softened by the ghost of last week's rain, filtering through sycamore branches like fractured glass. Mara loved market days. They reminded her of the times her mother used to take her by the hand, whispering the names of wild herbs or pointing to old spoons worn smooth by time. Those memories were soft now, like the worn corners of a favorite page. But Asher made them feel closer, somehow, like he carried something familiar in his silence. They passed by the bakery, where a curl of cinnamon steam warmed the air, and the butcher's, where Ewan was talking to a friend about firewood deliveries. Asher didn't stray far. His ears twitched, catching sounds only he could understand. Every move he made was deliberate, almost rehearsed, like a soldier walking through a town too quiet. It was when they turned the corner by the post office that everything shifted. A black truck rumbled up beside them and came to a slow, idle stop. The driver's window rolled down with a mechanical hiss, and Mara's fingers instinctively gripped the leash tighter. Trent Corrick. Even at a glance, there was something off about him. Too polished, too still. His boots were always clean in a town where no one's ever were. He wore a hat that looked like it belonged in a war museum, and eyes that didn't blink enough. Most people in Elderglen avoided talking about him, but never to his face. He stepped out, tall, crisp coat, leather gloves, his presence pressed against the street like a shadow swallowing warmth. "Morning," he said, his voice smooth as Riverstone. Mara didn't answer, but Asher did. A low, rumbling growl slid out of him like thunder from under the floorboards. His hackles raised, slow as fog rolling over hills. His body stiffened, but he didn't lunge. He didn't bark. He just stood, eyes locked, teeth showing. It was instinct, pure and raw, not fear, not confusion. Recognition. Trent's smile curved, tight, and cold. "You've got yourself a dangerous one, little girl." Mara said nothing, her eyes wide but steady. Her hand slipped behind her, touching Asher's flank. She felt his tension, a wire pulled taut, and she whispered, more to the air than to him, "It's okay. I've got you." The leash never jerked. Asher didn't move. He just stood there like a statue with a soul, refusing to back down. Trent's gaze flicked to the dog, then to Mara, lingering just long enough to unnerve. Then he chuckled the sound of boots on wet gravel and turned away. "Be careful where you walk him," he said over his shoulder. Some animals remember things better left forgotten. Before Mara could breathe, Ewan's voice cut through the square like the crack of a branch. "Mara, with me." He was already moving toward her, boots heavy on the cobbled path, jaw clenched. He didn't speak until they turned a corner and out of sight. "What happened?" he asked low, crouching to eye level with her. Mara looked at Asher, who had now gone still, his ears low, gaze distant. "He growled at that man. But it wasn't normal. It was like he knew something." Ewan looked down, frowning. "That wasn't just any man. That's Korik. He owns half the land past Ridge Hollow, including the forest edge." "He scares Asher," Mara said softly. Ewan hesitated. His hand hovered above Asher's head but didn't touch. "Asher's smart. Too smart." There was a pause. Then Mara, almost in a whisper, "Do you know who he was before?" Ewan didn't answer. Not yet. Instead, he glanced back toward the square where the black truck had just disappeared behind a bend. "Come on, we're heading home." But as they walked, Mara could feel the shift in Asher, in her father, in the air, like the surface of something had cracked, letting in a sliver of light, or warning. That night, Mara sat cross-legged in the loft above the woodshed, a book open but unread on her knees. Below her, she could hear Asher turning in his sleep, a soft whine catching in his throat. She crept down the ladder and knelt beside him. His paws twitched. "Asher," she whispered. His eyes opened, not startled, not wild, just tired, older than they should be. "You knew him," she said, "didn't you?" The wind outside picked up, rattling the loose latch on the window. Asher didn't move, but his eyes never left hers. "I don't care who you were before," she said, fingers brushing the thick fur of his neck. "You're safe now. I promise." He didn't whine, didn't wag. But he inched closer, laying his chin against her knee with the gentleness of something precious that had been broken before. And in that quiet space, in the hush of two hearts remembering how to trust, something unspoken passed between them, a vow. The first time Mara noticed, it was sometime past midnight. The wind had picked up, tossing dry leaves against the windows like a quiet warning. She rose, not for any particular reason, just a lingering instinct that nudged her from sleep. The house was still, wrapped in that eerie hush, only found in places tucked too far from town. She reached the door barefoot, her cardigan thrown over her shoulders, and there he was. Asher, sitting tall at the edge of the porch, framed by the silver spill of moonlight. His ears were erect, his breath quiet, but his gaze cut into the darkness of the tree line, as if searching for a memory he couldn't forget. Mara opened the door softly. The wood creaked, but he didn't flinch. His body remained still, like a statue carved of breath and muscle. Only his eyes moved, following something unseen. "You never sleep, do you?" she whispered. Asher didn't turn to look at her. He stayed as he was sentinel, shadow, shield, but his tail thumped once, lightly, against the old wood. Just enough to say, "I hear you. I'm here." She sat beside him for a moment, pulling her knees into her chest. The night air pressed against her skin, sharp and clean, her breath fogged in the cold. Far off, an owl called. Closer, something rustled in the brush. Asher didn't growl, didn't move. He simply watched, unshaken, alert. Mara followed his line of sight, but saw nothing. "Is it always like this in your head?" she asked quietly. "Always on guard?" She wasn't expecting an answer, not really, but something in her chest twisted when he exhaled slowly, almost as if the weight of her voice touched a part of him buried deep. When she finally stood to go back in, he didn't follow. He remained where he was, eyes burning into the forest like he was trying to remember what waited on the other side. The next morning she found him in the same spot. Not sleeping, not moving, just present. Ewan poured coffee in silence. His eyes flicked toward the porch, then back to his mug. "He was out there all night again," Mara said. "I noticed." She waited, but he said nothing more. "Doesn't that seem, I don't know, off?" Ewan shrugged, but his jaw was tight. "Some dogs don't sleep much, especially ones trained like him. He's not just watching, he's protecting." Ewan looked at her then. "From what?" Mara didn't answer, because she didn't know. And that, somehow, was worse. That night, she left the porch light off on purpose. She wanted to see what he was really looking at. From the upstairs window, she watched him again, a dark outline against the stars. His body tensed at every unfamiliar sound, yet he didn't bark, didn't chase, only observed. Like he knew the danger wouldn't come loud. It would come quiet, subtle. The way guilt enters a room, the way fear creeps in under the door. 3 nights passed, same routine. No matter how early she woke, Asher was already at his post, sometimes standing, sometimes lying down with his chin on his paws, but always facing the same direction, the woods. Mara began to notice things, small, disjointed details. The way his ears would perk whenever a certain part of the forest stirred always the same quadrant northeast of their property line. The faint line of mud tracked back to the brambles where she found him, which he sniffed each morning like a wound he couldn't forget. And the way he occasionally glanced at the shed, where Ewan kept the locked toolbox. By the 5th night, Mara placed a thick wool blanket outside, not to make him come in, but so he wouldn't feel so cold, even in silence. Asher looked at it once, then, slowly, laid down on it, his eyes never leaving the trees. Ewan grew quieter as the days passed. He no longer commented when he saw Asher lying near the steps, but his hand sometimes brushed the gun cabinet when he walked by, as if reminding himself it was still there. At dinner, he picked at his food, chewing slow, listening to things Mara couldn't hear. One evening, he muttered, "Dogs like him don't just stand guard for no reason." "M4." Mara's fork hovered midair. "What do you mean?" Ewan leaned back, sighing. "It's in their bones. If something trained him to watch, then something told him where to look." She stared at him. "Do you know what he's watching for?" His eyes didn't meet hers. "No," but the pause between the words said otherwise. That night, Mara sat beside Asher again. No words, just quiet. She placed her hand gently on his back, over the patch where the fur was thinner, scarred. His body didn't tense under her touch anymore. Instead, he leaned into her warmth slightly, just enough to remind her he was still alive beneath all that silence. "Whatever you're waiting for," she whispered, "you're not waiting alone." The wind shifted. A branch cracked in the woods, too heavy to be an animal. Asher stood instantly, body taut, eyes sharp, not growling, not moving forward, just ready. Mara followed his stare, and this time, in the distance between 2 trees, she thought she saw it a flicker of movement. Human, gone in a blink. Her breath caught. Asher stayed still until long after the shape disappeared. Then slowly, he laid back down, but his eyes never closed, not even once. The late autumn sun spilled through the thinning trees, casting long shadows that twitched like fingers on the forest floor. Mara should have been home an hour ago. Shoes off, homework half-heartedly open on the kitchen table. But something had drawn her, something she couldn't name, only follow. She'd heard it the night before, faint but deliberate. A clicking sound, mechanical and cold, threading through the wind like it didn't belong. Not the rustling of deer, not the snapping of old branches, something else. It had stopped just as she opened her bedroom window to listen, but it had stayed with her, echoing faintly in the back of her skull like a whisper that refused to die. Now, with the wind sharp against her jacket, she followed where the trees grew denser, a part of the woods even she hadn't dared explore before. The canopy overhead clawed at the sky, letting through only a dappled gray light that felt more like dusk than afternoon. The first thing she noticed was the smell, burnt and chemical, acrid like fireworks soaked in oil. Then came the silence. No birdsong, no wind, just her breath, and the faintest crunch of leaves beneath her boots. That's when she saw it. A circle of scorched ground, maybe 8 feet wide, sunken slightly, as if something heavy had pressed it down. The earth was blackened and hard like brittle clay, and at the very center was something glinting, partially buried in the ash. Mara knelt slowly. Her fingers brushed away a thin layer of dirt and pine needles until the shape emerged. A broken piece of glass, thick and curved. Not a bottle, not a mirror. It was too smooth, too exact. She dug a little more and uncovered part of a metal ring, a casing of some sort, with tiny etchings, numbers, or coordinates faded by heat. It was a lens. Camera grade, industrial. Her breath caught in her chest. Who put surveillance gear out here? She whispered to no one. Why? A low rustle in the underbrush made her spin. Asher, she called, half hopeful. But it wasn't him. Not yet. The rustling stopped. She stood quickly, the lens still clutched in her hand. A branch cracked deeper in the woods. Not snapped by wind. Deliberate. Like weight had moved over it. Hello. Her voice came out shaky, much smaller than she intended. No answer. She took one cautious step back, then froze. From somewhere just beyond the burnt ring, the sound came again. A faint click. Click. Pause. Click. Rhythmic. Measured. Not animal. Not natural. Her legs moved before her mind did. She turned and started running, but the underbrush caught at her boots, and the weight in her chest grew with every breath. She didn't even know which direction she was going, just away. A blur of gray darted in front of her. She stumbled, almost fell, but strong jaws clamped gently onto the sleeve of her jacket, steadying her. Asher, she gasped. His eyes weren't wild. They were focused, alert, and afraid. Not for himself, for her. He didn't bark, didn't growl, just tugged her backward, away from whatever lay beyond that scorched patch. Okay, I'm coming. They moved fast, him half guiding, half pushing her toward the break in the trees. She clutched the lens in her palm like a stone, heartbeat hammering. Her boots caught once on a root and again on her own breath. But Asher never let her fall. Not once. When they finally reached the edge of the tree line, the warmth of the open field struck her like a sudden exhale. The house sat distant and small under the cold light, chimney puffing thin smoke, a tether to normalcy. She paused, breath shaky. Asher didn't. He stood beside her, watching the woods behind them, his body low, ears forward. Still guarding, still listening. What did I find back there? She murmured, crouching beside him. He didn't look at her, only stared back at the place they'd come from, muscles taut beneath his fur. Something in the silence told her he knew. Maybe not the what, but certainly the who. And whoever they were, they hadn't finished watching. The fire had nearly burned itself down to embers when Mara stepped onto the porch. The evening had fallen quiet in that particular way it did, in the hills soft, thick, and slow, like a wool blanket pulled up over the world. Asher lay curled at the edge of the porch, his ears flicking at the faintest sounds. Wind rustling the pines, a moth batting against the screen door, the distant snap of something unseen in the brush. He didn't move otherwise. Only blinked as Mara passed by with 2 mugs in hand, one steaming with tea, the other with something stronger. Inside, Ewan sat alone at the table, staring at nothing. His forearms rested on the wood, calloused hands wrapped around an empty glass. There was a fatigue in the way his shoulders sat low, slack, as though carrying weight he hadn't put down in years. Mara placed the tea in front of him without a word. He looked at it, then at her, and gave a small nod. She sat across from him. For a long moment, they said nothing. The ticking of the old kitchen clock filled the space between them, steady and indifferent. I heard you get up last night, she finally said. You were out there with him. Ewan didn't answer right away. His thumb ran a slow circle along the rim of the glass. I don't sleep much these days, he murmured. Figured I might as well take a shift with the night watch. He doesn't sleep either, Mara said softly. He's always out there, just watching. Ewan exhaled through his nose. He knows what to look for. Mara studied him. The lines on his face were deeper than she remembered. Not age exactly. Something else. Like time had scraped across him. Not gently. You've seen dogs like him before, she said. It wasn't a question. Ewan's jaw tensed. He looked down at the table, the muscles in his face working against something unsaid. Finally, he nodded. His eyes, he said quietly. There's a knowing in them. Like he's been through things no animal should have to understand. Mara hesitated. Then, softly, did you know him? Before? Ewan's hands stilled. For a beat, everything was silent, but the wind pressing against the house. I didn't know him, he said, voice low. But I knew the man who handled him. Mara's breath caught. We served together. His name was Reed, Corporal Daniel Reed. He was good with dogs, better than most with people. We were in the same battalion during my 3rd deployment. She didn't interrupt. Her father rarely spoke of that part of his life. It came in fragments, like slivers of memory he didn't want but couldn't discard. There was a mission, he went on, the words slow, as if testing their own weight. Urban entry. Intel said it'd be quiet. It wasn't. He took a sip of tea that had already gone cold. Reed went in first, dog at his side, standard procedure. The building was booby-trapped, rigged to collapse from the inside. We heard the detonation before we even cleared the courtyard. Mara's hand moved instinctively toward her mug, though she didn't drink. We tried to get to them, Ewan said, his voice barely above a whisper now. But by the time we reached the blast site, there was nothing to do, just rubble and silence. Mara felt her throat tighten. She knew this kind of grief, not the sharp, loud kind, but the hollow ache that settled in a man's bones. I carried that, he said. Still do. She looked up, her eyes shining. Why didn't you ever tell me? Ewan gave a hollow smile. Because some wounds don't bleed on the outside. And I thought, maybe if I didn't speak it, it wouldn't grow. He stared at the grain of the table. But now this dog shows up, same markings, same scars, same haunted stare, and it's like the past just got up and walked through my front door. Mara reached across the table and placed her hand over his. His fingers twitched but didn't pull away. He's not a ghost, she said gently. He's still here, breathing, watching, choosing to stay. Ewan looked at her then, really looked, and in his daughter's face, he saw not just the girl she'd been, but the woman she was becoming, quietly fierce, open-hearted, and unafraid of shadows. I think you were meant to find him, he said. She nodded once. And I think he was meant to stay. They sat in silence after that, letting the weight of memory settle between them, not as something to be buried, but something finally named. Outside, Asher stirred. He stood slowly, ears pricked toward the trees. Somewhere out there, something moved a rustle too purposeful to be wind. But the dog didn't growl, didn't chase. He just stood, steady and still, as if he knew nothing would come through that he wouldn't be ready for. Not tonight. It was a soft, sunlit afternoon when Mara discovered the truth. She had been brushing Asher's thick coat in the backyard, sitting cross-legged on the warm stone steps of the porch. Summer was loosening its grip, and golden leaves drifted lazily from the birches at the tree line. Asher, as usual, sat patiently. His weight settled, but his eyes alert. He tolerated the brush like a soldier standing at ease still, silent, always ready. Her fingers grazed the leather collar beneath the tufts of his neck, and she felt something unfamiliar, a small metal ridge, tucked beneath the inner lining. Curious, she unfastened the collar and ran her hand along its underside. That's when she found it. A tarnished dog tag, wedged into a hidden slit. It clinked faintly as she pulled it out, the way memories sometimes rattle when unearthed. She squinted at the engraving. R.D. Reed, K. 9, Asher. Unit 412 Tactical. Do not duplicate. The tag was old, scratched from years of friction, but the name Reed was clear. Asher, she whispered, the word catching in her throat. The dog didn't react. He simply looked at her, head slightly tilted, like he was waiting for something she hadn't yet said. A name he already knew. She ran inside with the tag, her breath caught between disbelief and dread. Dad, she called. Dad, can I talk to you for a second? Ewan was at the kitchen sink, sleeves rolled up, scrubbing mud off his boots from patrol. He turned at the sound of her voice and wiped his hands on a towel. "What's up?" he asked, noticing the way she clutched something tight in her fist. She opened her palm slowly, as though revealing a wound. When Ewan saw the tag, the blood drained from his face. "Where did you get that?" he said, his voice barely audible. "It was tucked in Asher's collar. Who's R.D. Reed?" Ewan didn't answer right away. He reached for the tag like it might vanish, cradling it in his fingers as though it were too fragile to hold but too sacred to let go. His shoulders stiffened. The room filled with silence, not the empty kind, but the thick, aching kind that holds memory. "That dog," he finally said, "should be dead." Mara blinked. "What do you mean?" Ewan walked to the kitchen table and sat down slowly, the tag still in his hand. "Reed was my friend, my brother in arms. We served together in the 412th Tactical K-9 Unit deployed in city suppression zones. That dog." He looked toward the back door, where Asher now lay quietly, eyes trained on the woods beyond. That dog was his partner. Mara eased into the seat across from him, her heart thudding. What happened to them? Ewan inhaled deeply, as if the memory itself weighed tons. There was a mission, classified at the time, the kind that leaves scars without medals. We were tracking a suspected insurgent group holed up in an abandoned transit center. Urban maze, heat signatures, radio silence. It was a setup. Someone leaked our coordinates. We walked into a trap. His eyes clouded with things Mara couldn't see. There were explosives, he continued. Snipers, chaos. Reed and Asher were point team. They went in first, cleared the hallway, then it blew. Everything. Fire, metal, screaming. I remember running through smoke, shouting for him. But there was nothing left of the corridor except a wall of flame. He swallowed hard. They said Reed didn't make it, that the dog's vitals stopped transmitting. Command wrote it off. No recovery possible. We held a service, folded flags, gave a speech. I thought they were both gone. But Asher didn't die, Mara said softly. Ewan nodded slowly. Number. Somehow he got out. Maybe he ran. Maybe someone pulled him. Maybe he knew better than any of us what was coming. Mara's voice trembled. Why didn't he come back? Because he's trained not to, Ewan said. These dogs, they're programmed to obey, to protect, to survive. If his handler died, if the unit fell apart, he'd be adrift. No orders, no home, just instinct and ghosts. He looked out the window toward Asher again. And now he's here. Mara clutched the tag in her hands. I called him Asher before I knew. I swear. I didn't even mean to. I just found the name in one of Mom's old notebooks, and it felt right. Ewan gave a slow, brittle nod. It was always his name. And a long silence stretched between them. Not empty. Not bitter. Just full. Like the space between thunder and rain. Dad, she said at last, do you think he remembers? Ewan didn't answer. Instead, he rose from his chair and walked outside. Mara followed. Asher sat upright on the porch now, eyes fixed on them. When Ewan knelt down, the dog didn't flinch. He didn't move. He just watched, unblinking. Ewan placed the tag gently on the step beside him. You made it home, he said, voice breaking. And I never knew. Asher leaned forward then, slow and deliberate, and touched his muzzle to the tag. A breath passed through the air between them like a shared prayer. Mara stood behind her father, hand resting on his back. No one spoke, because sometimes, when wounds run deep and ghosts linger close, silence is the only language that still understand. The attic door groaned as Mara pushed it open with slow, deliberate hands. Dust spiraled in the shaft of sunlight that cut through the narrow window, catching on cobwebs and the breath she held tight in her chest. It was quiet up here, too, quiet for a house that had learned to live with secrets. Asher didn't follow. He waited at the foot of the stairs, eyes trained upward like a sentinel. He didn't whine, didn't bark, just watched. Mara gave him a small nod, one hand brushing the edge of her jeans as if wiping off the guilt already beginning to cling. She hadn't meant to sneak, not at first, but after finding the tag in Asher's collar and watching her father's face crumble like stone under too much weather, something inside her had shifted. That name Reed had haunted the edges of Ewan's silence ever since. And now, it clung to the house like damp air before a storm. She found the war chest beneath a threadbare tarp, the old cedar box bearing brass corners worn to the wood. It didn't look locked, but something about it felt ceremonial, like it wasn't meant to be opened except by memory itself. The lid creaked when she lifted it, the hinges reluctant after so many years. Inside, the scent of smoke and oil rose faintly. Her father's old uniform, neatly folded. A few medals tucked beside it. A cracked, leather-bound notebook with dog-eared pages. But it was the photographs that caught her breath, sepia-toned ghosts trapped in silver edges. Her mother was there, young, smiling. Before the chemo, before the hospital. Before Mara even existed, she stood with two men. One of them was Ewan, in his sharper days. The other a man with kind eyes, darker skin, sleeves rolled up, and a quiet ease to his grin must have been Reed. And behind them, a figure in the background, distant, watching. Mara leaned in. It was Trent Corrick, not as broad-shouldered, not yet hardened by the years, but the smirk was the same, the kind that made your stomach tighten without knowing why. She flipped through the stack quickly, her heartbeat racing. In one photo, her mother had her arm hooked around Reed's. In another, Reed knelt beside a dog, a German shepherd, unmistakably Asher. Or not Asher. Not then. But the stance, the alert ears, the intelligent eyes, it was him. It was always him. Beneath the photos, tucked in a faded envelope sealed with wax, was a single folded paper. The words on the outside were stamped in red. Classified, eyes only. R.D. Reed. Mara stared at it, hand hovering like it might bite. She didn't open it. Not yet. Not here. She tucked the letter into her coat, along with a photo of her mother standing beside Reed and Asher. It felt wrong, but she couldn't let it stay hidden, not after everything. She closed the chest as quietly as she could, even though she knew it wouldn't matter. Some doors, once opened, echo long after. When she turned to leave, she found Asher sitting on the third step, waiting like he'd known she'd come back with something heavier than she could carry. Downstairs, Ewan sat in the armchair, elbows on his knees, watching the fire. He didn't hear her come down. His fingers moved slowly over a silver lighter, open, closed, open, closed. The rhythmic click was the only sound in the room. Mara hesitated at the bottom of the stairs. She considered telling him right then, laying the letter in his lap and demanding the truth. But something about the angle of his shoulders, the way his eyes looked not into the flames but through them, made her stop. Some wounds, he'd once said, didn't bleed on the outside. So she slipped past, quiet as snowfall, Asher following at her side like a shadow. In her room, Mara pulled the letter out and set it on her desk. She didn't open it. Not yet. Her hands trembled too much. Instead, she looked at the photo again, the one with her mother and Reed and Asher. There was warmth in their eyes, something unspoken but present, like the way light finds its way through curtains just before dawn. She wondered what her mother had seen in Reed. She wondered what her father had lost. And most of all, she wondered what kind of man Trent Corrick had been, lurking on the edges of their lives even then. Asher curled beside her bed, tail brushing gently against the floor. He didn't sleep, he rarely did, but he didn't seem tense either, only waiting. Mara placed the photo under her pillow, the way she had with childhood wishes, and turned out the light. The letter remained on the desk unopened, but no longer forgotten. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, and somewhere in the house, silence shifted. The snow fell sideways in the dream. It wasn't snow in the way children understood it. Soft, silent, forgiving. It was ash-colored, fast, and bitter. It scratched against Asher's muzzle like needles. He stood motionless in the center of it, ears taut, every sinew tight as wire. Smoke clawed across the road in thick, coiling tendrils. Somewhere beyond it, something had cracked open the world. Boom! The sound came after the light, like it always did. A shattering, ugly light. A flash that ripped shadows out of hiding and forced every memory to the surface. Through the ringing in his ears, Asher caught the last syllables of Reed's voice, a yell swallowed by the blast. He turned toward it, paws slipping in mud that stank of fuel and scorched metal. Then silence. The kind of silence that's not absence, but aftermath. Asher's nose searched frantically. The scent of Reed's sweat, coffee, peppermint oil was faint, but there. He bolted through smoke, weaving past a burning Humvee, its tires still spinning uselessly in the air. His paws skidded on slick concrete. He found the body half buried beneath twisted steel. "Reed," Asher whimpered. The man groaned once. Blood trickled from his mouth, mixing with ash. Reed's fingers twitched, then curled toward the dog. A promise passed in a blink, not with words, but with eyes. Then the gunfire began. Not distant. Close. Clean. Surgical. Asher's ears swiveled toward it, registering something wrong. These weren't enemies from the outside. These were single shots, paced, deliberate, like drills. He ducked low behind rubble, watching through a crack in the wall. Two men moved in the open, weapons raised, but they weren't searching, they were finishing. One man checked pulse after pulse. The other walked with practiced detachment. And then Asher saw the boots. They moved with the quiet authority of someone who belonged. Polished, black, military issued, but too clean for the field. The hem of a coat brushed the snow. The boots stopped near Reed's body. Asher froze, his breath caught mid-exhale. The man didn't kneel. He didn't call for medics. He simply stared for a moment and then turned. Gunfire again. But this time, not directed outward. Not random. Asher's instincts screamed. He bolted through the rubble, toward a thicket of shattered fencing and gnarled brush, not even realizing when a piece of rebar tore into his side. He didn't feel it. He didn't feel anything except the pull, the command that Reed had never given with words, "Survive." He didn't stop running until the smoke faded behind him and the snow turned to fog. Asher jolted awake with a low growl, chest heaving. The porch was quiet. Moonlight stretched thin across the floorboards. His coat bristled, damp with cold sweat that no one would see. Mara's room was still lit. The girl often fell asleep with a book on her chest. She had a habit of reading aloud to Asher when the wind got too loud. Tonight, though, she was awake. He heard the faint creak of her mattress, a whisper of breath held too long. He moved to her window. Inside, Mara sat on the floor in pajama pants and a frayed hoodie, knees pulled up to her chest. Her hand rested on the edge of a folder, the one with the photos she wasn't supposed to find. Her other hand gripped a folded letter, still unopened. She looked up as if she'd felt Asher's presence before she heard him. Their eyes met through the glass. Neither of them spoke, of course. But the silence between them had a shape now, like a shadow taking form. Mara pressed her forehead gently to the glass. Asher sat down on the other side, ears alert, breath steadying. His side still ached phantom pain from a wound long healed but never forgotten. And in the stillness of the porch, as the wind rustled branches that whispered too much, Asher closed his eyes again, not to sleep, but to remember, to watch. By late September, the chill and elderglen crept in early, slipping beneath door frames and seeping into the bones of old houses like memory. The leaves had begun their slow bleed of amber and rust, a quiet surrender. In the diner, under flickering fluorescent lights and the muted clatter of forks, people whispered more than they spoke. "Trent owns that plot too now," murmured Mr. Grady, tilting his coffee mug with calloused hands. "The one behind the mill used to be community land. He funds the sheriff's re-election every cycle," said May, not looking up from the pie she was slicing. "You think that badge means anything when it comes to him?" No one disagreed. No one ever did when it came to Trent Halverson. He wasn't a man who shouted to be feared he didn't need to. He walked quietly through town, a firm hand on every transaction, a shadow behind every favor. Land deeds had a way of changing hands when he was involved. Loans got mysteriously approved or revoked. The sheriff never seemed to notice the trucks that rumbled through the forest after dark. Headlights off, taillights blacked out. The youth camp at the edge of town, the one no one had asked for, got built in under a month. No ribbon-cutting ceremony, no press, just cold fences and colder guards. That night, under a graying sky and the thrum of wind through the trees, Asher stood at the tree line, across from that camp, silent, still. Mara didn't notice him gone at first. She had been up late, sorting her homework, fingers smudged with graphite, the house humming in that soft way it did when it was settling. Ewan was out back, splitting wood by lantern light, sleeves rolled to his elbows, eyes unreadable as always. It wasn't until she leaned out to call Asher in that she saw the porch empty. "Asher?" she called, stepping outside. No paw prints in the damp grass. No jingle of his collar. She felt it again, that weight in the woods. Like being watched by something that had never blinked. The next morning, she asked Ewan, "Have you noticed him slipping out at night?" He paused mid-sip of his coffee. "You sure?" "I saw him across from the fence," she said, hesitating. "The one by the youth camp." His jaw tightened. "You didn't follow him, did you?" But something's not right with that place." Ewan looked down at his hands. "Trent says it's a rehab program for troubled boys. Gives them discipline, structure." "Is that what he told you back when Mom was alive?" she asked too sharply. Regret immediately bloomed in her chest. He didn't answer. He just stood, reached for his jacket, and left the room. People didn't talk openly about the camp, but stories leaked in the way small towns breathe rumors like smoke. Some said they heard shouting late at night, voices strained and frightened. Others swore the fences weren't just to keep the kids in, they were to keep something out. Mara rode her bike past the edge of the compound after school. The gravel road turned to dirt, and the wind carried with it a strange tang. Metallic, unnatural. The buildings were plain, squat things. The kind of architecture that forgets it was ever made by human hands. No signs, no welcome. She saw them, boys in uniform gray sweats, standing in straight lines like pieces on a board. Their heads shaved, expressions distant. A man with mirrored sunglasses barked something none of them responded to. They didn't even flinch. Then she saw it across the clearing, in the shadows near the trees, a silhouette. Ears perked, posture tense. Asher. He was watching, just watching, and then he was gone. That night, she waited. The house was quiet by 11. Ewan's bedroom door was closed, a sliver of light glowing beneath. Mara sat cross-legged on her bed, clutching the military tag she'd found in Asher's collar days before. Red Reed, K9 Asher. Her thumb traced the faded letters. When she heard the soft scratch at the door, she rose and padded down the hall barefoot. The porch creaked under her step, but she didn't care. Asher stood there, tail still, gaze fixed on the darkness. "You're going again, aren't you?" she whispered. He didn't look at her, just flicked his ears, tense and alert, as if waiting for a signal that would never come. "Why that place?" She stepped forward, placing her hand gently on his head. His fur was cool, damp from the night air, and then he moved a slow turn of the head toward her. Their eyes met. There was something in that look, not just instinct, not just duty, memory. "Asher," she breathed. "What did they do to you?" The next morning, she found paw prints in the mud, leading toward the camp. But more than that, claw marks on the outer fence. Deep, repeated, like something had returned again and again, testing its boundary, seeking, searching. The town had grown quieter. People watched the road more often. The sheriff drove by the Halverson estate twice as much. No one said a word. But the silence, like everything else Trent touched, was cracking. That Sunday, in the chapel where Mara's mother used to sing, Pastor Leland paused mid-sermon. His hands trembled as he adjusted his glasses. His voice, usually firm, wavered. "Sometimes evil doesn't wear horns," he said. "Sometimes it buys up land and builds fences." No one applauded. No one moved. Asher wasn't in his usual seat by the back pew. He was watching the camp, and someone was watching back. The attic groaned beneath Mara's careful steps. Dust hung like fog in the shaft of late morning light that poured through the single round window. She hadn't meant to come here. Not really. But Asher had been pawing at the base of the stairs for an hour, whining low in his throat like something waited above. Now she stood in the forgotten space, heart ticking louder than the creaks of the old floorboards. Everything up here smelled like cedar and ghosts. Boxes were stacked in uneven rows, some marked in her mother's handwriting, faded by time and heat. Her fingers brushed the tops one by one. Baby clothes. Summer 2009, Emily, do not open. She opened that one. Inside were little things. A music box with a ballerina stuck in mid-spin. A crocheted scarf that still smelled faintly of lavender. A notebook with brittle pages, pressed with dried clover. And beneath it all, almost as if hidden on purpose, a photograph, folded once and then torn in half. Mara unfolded it carefully. Her mother stood in a field of tall grass. Sunlight caught in her hair, laughing at someone just out of frame. It was a joy Mara didn't recognize. Not the tired smile in kitchen photos. Not the calm, distant face she recalled from hospital beds and whispered apologies. This was before, but the other half was gone, not just torn, but charred along the edge, the paper brittle and scorched as if it had tried to survive a fire. On the back, someone had scrawled a note in blocky, slanted writing. "He's closer than you think. Don't trust Trent." Her mother's name wasn't signed. It didn't need to be. Mara stared at the handwriting. She'd memorized it from old birthday cards, from notes tucked in lunchboxes. "Have a great day, Peanut." Always rounded letters, a soft curl on the Y. This matched perfectly. This was Emily. This was her. Her knees gave a little, and she sat hard on the attic floor, dust rising around her like ash. Asher padded over silently and lay beside her, his breath warm on her wrist. "He lied," she whispered, voice small. All this time she knew. Asher shifted slightly, his body tense. Downstairs, the sound of the back door slammed Ewan returning from the station. For a moment, Mara considered tucking everything back, pretending this never happened. But her hands curled tight around the photograph. Not this time. She stood and folded the picture carefully, placing it inside her jacket pocket. The box she left open. Let someone else find it and wonder. Let someone else follow the trail her mother left behind. Downstairs, Ewan was washing his hands in the sink. Back to the door. "Dad." He turned, wiping his fingers on a dish towel. His face looked older than it had yesterday. "Yeah, honey?" She hesitated, hand resting over her jacket. But she didn't pull it out, not yet. "Did Mom ever mention Trent before she got sick?" His jaw shifted, and for a beat, he didn't answer. Then he tossed the towel on the counter and turned off the tap. "She knew him," he said finally. "We all did." Back then, Mara watched his eyes carefully. Did she ever say not to trust him? Ewan gave a short, hollow laugh. "Your mother didn't like a lot of people. She trusted even fewer." "That's not an answer." He looked away. She had reasons, I'm sure. Things between them changed. "After the city," Mara repeated softly. "Where Reed died." Ewan's shoulders stiffened. She felt Asher brush against the back of her leg. Silent support. "I think she was trying to warn us," Mara said, voice barely audible. "I think Trent's more involved than we thought." Ewan didn't speak for a long moment. Then he reached into the cabinet, pulled out a mug, and poured the rest of the coffee pot into it. When he finally turned back to her, his expression was unreadable. "Some ghosts," he murmured, "don't stay buried, no matter how deep we try to plant them." Mara opened her mouth, but he walked past her, coffee in hand, disappearing down the hallway. She stood there in the kitchen, the silence pressing around her like fog. The scent of old ash still lingered in her hands. Later that night, she unfolded the photograph again beneath the lamplight in her room. She touched the edge where the other half had once been, where someone stood beside her mother, just outside the frame. Was it Trent? Was it Reed? Asher lay on the rug, watching her. His ears twitched slightly, alert even in rest. Mara turned the photograph over again, rereading the words. "He's closer than you think." She felt it too. Not just fear, but something deeper. A reckoning coming down the road. The knock came soft but sure, like someone who didn't want to disturb, but needed to be heard. Ewan set his mug down slowly, listening. Outside, the cold fog hung low over the yard like a breath held too long. Asher was already at the window, ears alert, shoulders stiff. He didn't growl. He didn't need to. Mara leaned in from the hallway. "Who is it?" Ewan motioned for her to stay back. He opened the door. Standing just beyond the porch light was a man in uniform khaki shirt, badge dulled from sun and years. Deputy Maris. His face was young but tired, like someone who'd learned too early that silence kept you employed in Elderglen. "Evening, Mr. Callahan," the deputy said, voice careful. "Sorry to bother you." Ewan crossed his arms. "You're not here for coffee." The deputy offered a hollow chuckle, then adjusted his belt.
"Got a call from up by Timberline Road. Some reports about a dog."
"Big Shepherd." Someone said it looked military. Ewan's jaw tightened. "That right?" "Yeah." Said it was near the fence at the old rehab camp. Could be scaring folks. One woman swears it barked at her kid. Mara stepped forward now, despite Ewan's sideways glance. So, barking's a crime? Deputy Maris held up a hand.
No, ma'am. Just checking. You know how people get.
Ewan didn't move. Dog's licensed, lives here, ain't going anywhere. The deputy shifted. Understood. Just doing my rounds. But if it's all right, maybe keep him indoors more? Some folks spook easy these days. Ewan said nothing. Asher stood behind him like a shadow, unmoving. Maris cleared his throat. Well, take care. He turned, boots crunching over frostbitten leaves, and disappeared down the drive. His cruiser idled at the road longer than it should have. When Ewan shut the door, the silence returned. Not empty, but watchful. Mara looked up at her father. You think he's working for Trent? Ewan's eyes flicked to the window. I think Maris is just scared. Scared of losing more than his paycheck. That night, the wind had teeth. It snapped through the siding and rattled the porch swing. But the real chill didn't come from the cold. It came just after 2 a.m. Asher was the first to sense it. One second he was curled at the foot of Mara's bed. The next he was up silent and taut. He didn't bark. He moved like memory, slipping through shadows down the hallway toward the back. Then came the noise, soft, metallic, the unmistakable rattle of the shed door latch. Ewan was already halfway down the stairs when he heard the sharp growl. Not loud, focused. The sound a soldier makes before springing a trap. The shed sat behind the house, half tools, half memory. No one but Ewan had reason to go there, which is why, the second he heard Asher crash through the dog door and into the dark, his hand reached for the old revolver in the drawer. By the time he stepped onto the back porch, flashlight beam cutting through the mist, Asher was already circling, tail high, snarling low. And there, just past the fence, a figure, running. Ewan aimed the light. The intruder glanced back once, face half-masked, coat torn. Asher lunged, teeth bared, but the man dropped something and vanished into the trees. Footsteps scattered over pine needles, swallowed by distance. Mara appeared behind her father, barefoot, clutching her coat. What happened? Ewan didn't answer. He stepped into the yard. Asher was sniffing the object left behind. Hackles raised. It was a taser standard issue. Police grade, black casing, modified grip. The kind used in canine suppression training. Ewan picked it up with gloved fingers, turned it over. On the side was a faded sticker, a number. Property of Elderglen Sheriff's Department. He turned to Asher, whose gaze hadn't shifted from the woods. Someone tried to take him, Mara whispered. Ewan didn't nod. He didn't need to. He pocketed the taser and looked toward the shed. The lock was broken clean, no signs of rusted struggle. Just a clean pop, like someone knew what they were doing, knew what they were looking for. Inside, nothing was stolen, but everything had been touched. The war chest was ajar. Ewan stared at it for a long moment. Then he whispered to Asher, We're out of time. Back in the kitchen, Mara traced the edge of a chipped ceramic mug. Her hands trembled. Why would someone from the sheriff's office come after him? Ewan laid the taser on the table. Because Asher remembers things they want buried. She looked up. Do you? His silence was answer enough. Asher sat beside the back door now, eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the porch. Not wagging, not resting, just watching. Mara turned to him, her voice soft but unflinching. Then it's time we stop hiding, before they come back. The morning mist hadn't lifted when Asher pawed at Mara's door. Not scratched, pawed slow, deliberate. A quiet insistence. She blinked awake, sat up, and looked toward the sound. He wasn't whining, just waiting. When she opened the door, he turned without looking at her, tail low, head forward. Where are we going? She whispered. But Asher didn't answer. He didn't need to. He led her past the back fence, where pine needles blanketed the ground in a soft hush. The woods were quieter than usual, even the crows had fallen silent. Ewan was still asleep, and Mara hadn't left a note. She just followed, one hand brushing the edge of her coat pocket, where she'd tucked the folded letter she still hadn't shown her father. It was the way Asher moved that told her this wasn't a walk. It was a mission. They wove deeper into the timber, beyond the clearing where she'd once found the half-buried camera lens. The trees thickened, roots tangled. Asher didn't hesitate. He moved as though following a memory that hadn't faded, a trail only he could sense. His ears were forward, body tight with focus, as if he were stepping through time. Half an hour passed before he stopped. They'd come to a slope of earth, partially hidden beneath a fallen tree, its trunk rotted and sun-bleached, tangled with old bramble. Asher began digging at the base, claws methodical, tail still. His breathing was even like this had always been the plan. Mara dropped to her knees beside him. The earth was loose, recently disturbed but only just. A few feet down, her hand scraped metal. A handle. She cleared it slowly, revealing a long, rusted container, military grade, thick casing, padlocked but corroded. She looked at Asher. His eyes met hers for a moment, not wagging, not excited, just present. Mara used a stick to pry at the latch. It gave with a snap. Inside, layered in plastic wrap and old oilcloth, were maps. Dozens of them, some marked in red ink, others with symbols she didn't recognize. Beneath them, a leather-bound field notebook, a waterproof pouch with a half-dozen USB drives, and a faded photograph of 3 men and a dog. Her father, Reed, Trent, and Asher, younger but unmistakable, eyes sharp, ears high, standing tall beside his handler. She flipped the photo over. The back was scrawled in a hurried hand. "If this reaches you, you already know. Follow the shipments. Trent isn't just selling land, he's moving weapons. R.D. Reed." Mara sat back. Breath caught in her throat. The woods around her pulsed with stillness. Asher nosed the notebook gently toward her. She opened it. Inside were coordinates, transaction dates, locations marked with code names. One entry circled 3 times, read, Camp Sentinel, Elder Glen. Final transfer scheduled. It was dated the day before Reed died. She touched the page like it might burn her fingers. This wasn't just a stash, it was a last message. A trail of truth buried like contraband. "Asher," she murmured, voice cracking. "He left this for you, didn't he?" The dog pressed his head gently to her shoulder. No sound, no weight, just contact. A confirmation beyond language. Mara slid the USBs into her coat. They were cold, unassuming things, but she held them like they were fragile. It wasn't just about Asher now. It was about Reed. It was about her mother's torn photograph. It was about everything her father wouldn't say and everything Trent had buried. The sun was beginning to rise beyond the trees, the first light catching dew on the underbrush. Asher turned and began walking back, slow but steady. Mara followed, hugging the evidence to her chest. By the time they reached the edge of the woods, Ewan was standing on the porch, rifle in hand, eyes storm dark. She stopped at the tree line. He looked at the dirt on her knees, the rusted metal streaking her hands, and the glint of the USB in her coat pocket. "What did you find?" he asked, voice low. Mara opened her mouth, but her voice failed, so she held up the photograph instead. His face changed, the rifle lowered. "Reed's not just a ghost," she said, "and Asher didn't come back by accident." For a moment, the wind rushed between them, rustling branches like whispers. Then Ewan stepped down from the porch and met her halfway. "Come inside," he said quietly. "We've got work to do." Asher lingered at the doorway, gaze locked toward the forest as though he knew the silence wouldn't last long. The forest changed as they walked deeper in. What had once been a trail of scattered pine needles and deer prints gave way to silence, the kind that made you hold your breath without realizing. Mara followed Asher closely, her boots crunching soft moss beneath the layers of fallen leaves. Above them, the trees leaned inward, as if protecting a secret. She didn't ask where they were going. She didn't need to. Asher moved with purpose, head low, ears perked, tail still. Every few steps, he'd pause and glance back, checking if she was keeping up. She always was. Hours must have passed, but she didn't feel tired, only cold. The kind of cold that seeped from the ground up, through her jeans and jacket, into the space behind her ribs. The last time she'd felt it was the day of her mother's funeral. Then, just beyond a slope of rocks tangled in wild raspberry thorns, the cabin appeared. It was barely more than a shadow at first. Weather-beaten wood slats grayed by rain, a sagging tin roof draped in snow and rot. One shutter hung crooked by a single nail. There were no paths leading to it, no tire marks, no worn footsteps, just wilderness and this forgotten box of memory tucked inside it. Asher stopped at the front, nose to the door. He didn't bark. He didn't whimper. He just sat. Mara stepped beside him, brushing damp hair from her face. The door creaked open with a sound that reminded her of old hinges in the attic, the kind her mother used to say, "Remember too much." Inside was dark, dust-laced air swirling in beams of light that broke through slats in the walls. A kettle sat rusted on a small stove, long, cold. An unmade cot leaned against the far corner, blankets moth-eaten but folded. There was a shelf with half-burned candles, a cracked compass, a knife with the initials RDR etched faintly on its handle. "Read," Mara whispered. She didn't know how she knew. She just did. Asher circled the space once before walking toward the wall opposite the door. There, carved into the wood, half hidden beneath peeling bark and smoke stain, were words rough-hewn by a pocket knife. "Protect the girl. Asher knows." Mara's throat tightened. She reached out and touched the carving fingertips over each groove, like reading braille from a ghost. The air felt different in that moment. Not haunted, exactly, but heavy. Like something had been waiting. She moved slowly around the room. Near the cot, she found a flannel shirt with blood dried at the cuff. Beneath a loose floorboard, she uncovered a rusted metal tin containing a photograph, a man in military gear, with his arm around her mother, both laughing, younger. Asher sat obediently at their feet, tongue out, eyes bright. She dropped to the floor, knees hitting the wood, her breath hitched. "This was real," she whispered. You were hers too, like..." Asher sat beside her, not touching, just close enough that she felt his warmth. She didn't cry, not fully, but her hands trembled as she held the photo. It felt like holding a piece of herself she never knew was missing. There was more in the cabin. A radio missing its battery pack, a journal half burned, a map of the county with red X's in the woods north of Elderglen. Each X corresponded to areas they were forbidden to go, campgrounds that had been shut down for safety, trails that disappeared from updated town maps. This wasn't just a hideout. It had been a place of watching. "I think he knew something," Mara said softly. "Something they didn't want him to tell." Asher laid down, chin on his paws. He stared at the door, listening. A twig snapped outside. Mara froze. She moved to the window, crouching just below the glass. A figure passed by in the trees, not close, but too near to be wandering. She couldn't make out a face, only the silhouette of a man in a thick coat, shoulders too stiff to be lost. He didn't look at the cabin. He didn't need to. "Someone's still watching," she murmured. Asher rose. He didn't growl, but something in him shifted. The stillness became alert. His body lined with tension, but not fear. Awareness. Mara stood too. "We have to go." She didn't take the photo. She folded it gently and placed it back in the tin. Reed had hidden it for a reason. It wasn't just memory, it was evidence. Back outside, the forest felt different. The wind had picked up. The clouds above were gray, but not storming, just watchful, the same way Asher's eyes always were. As they began the long walk back, Asher stayed a step ahead always, between her and the path behind. And Mara, though tired, though shaken, held the map tightly against her chest, because something told her the truth wasn't buried. It was waiting to be seen. By the time they emerged from the woods, dusk had bled into night. The cabin lights were still off when Mara and Asher stepped out onto the gravel road behind the property. Her boots, soaked from melted snow and stream water, squelched faintly. She didn't speak. Not yet. She kept one hand tucked in the inside pocket of her coat, gripping the folded map and the tattered journal pages she'd taken from Reed's hidden stash. Asher padded beside her, quieter than the wind, yet hyper-aware. His eyes scanned the tree line. Every snap of twig or distant owl call sent his ears pivoting. The truth they'd found didn't feel like an answer. It felt like a beginning. The porch light flicked on just as they reached the cabin. Ewan stood in the doorway, arms crossed, shadows buried deep in the wrinkles around his eyes. His gaze landed on the papers in Mara's hand, then on the dog. "You went deep," he said flatly. "Too deep." Mara didn't respond. She brushed past him into the house. He didn't press. Not yet. Inside, the cabin felt colder than usual. The kind of cold that had nothing to do with weather. Mara set the documents on the kitchen table, her fingers trailing over the faded ink and cryptic coordinates. Her mother's name had been scribbled in the margin of one page, circled 3 times. She stared at it until her eyes blurred. "I think Mom knew," she whispered. Ewan leaned against the doorway. His voice was quiet, almost ashamed. "She knew more than I ever did, and it cost her everything." Asher sat by the front door, unmoving, ears twitching every so often as if listening to something they couldn't hear. Mara turned to her father. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because it wasn't safe. It's not safe now either." They stared at each other. Ewan's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. He walked over to the coat rack, grabbed the shotgun that had hung there since Mara was a toddler, and checked its chamber. "You're not wrong," he said. The rest of the evening passed in near silence. Mara sat curled on the couch, the folded photo of her mother still tucked in her lap. Asher lay at her feet, body stretched out but alert. Ewan didn't sleep. He sat near the window, watching the edge of the woods, like a soldier waiting for movement in the brush. It was after midnight when it happened. A thud heavy, sudden struck the front door. Asher shot up, growling, teeth bared. Ewan grabbed the shotgun and moved fast, Mara only a step behind. When Ewan yanked open the door, the wind swept inside, biting cold and thick with the scent of damp pine. The porch was empty, no figure, no sound, nothing in the trees but darkness. And then Ewan saw it. A hunting knife, blade buried halfway into the wooden panel of the door, pinning a folded sheet of paper. He stared at it for a moment, the silence, stretching out like something alive. Then he pulled it free. Mara held her breath as he unfolded it. 4 words were written in thick black marker. Crude, fast, but unmistakable. "Stop digging, or she disappears like her mother." Ewan didn't speak. He didn't need to. Mara had already seen the words. She stepped forward slowly, her voice just above a whisper. "So, it wasn't an accident." Ewan closed his eyes. "Just for a moment. I always feared it wasn't. Now I know." Asher stood at the threshold, nose high, tail rigid. His stare cut into the forest like a blade. No sound, no movement, but he didn't relax. Not for a second. Ewan turned back inside and shut the door, bolting it. He walked straight to the old chest in the living room, the one Mara had once peeked into behind his back. Without hesitation, he knelt and unlocked it, dragging out a series of folders, photos, and documents that looked too official for any civilian to keep. "I should have burned this all years ago," he muttered. "But something told me it wasn't over." Mara knelt beside him. "Who's doing this?" Ewan pulled out a file marked Operation Timberline, stamped classified in faded red ink. "I think Reed found something he wasn't supposed to. And your mother helped him." He looked down at her, voice softening. That dog showing up again wasn't coincidence. Asher came back for a reason. Mara nodded, barely breathing. "To finish what they started. A silence fell between them, not fear, exactly, but weight. The kind that comes from understanding your world has changed, and there's no going back." Ewan rose, walked to the window, and parted the curtain just enough to see the tree line again. "We won't be the ones running." Mara stared down at Asher. His eyes weren't just watchful now. They were waiting. He had known this moment would come. From the second he stepped out of the woods and into her life, this had been building, a circle closing. Mara walked to the table, took the map again, and laid it beside the old mission logs. "Then we need to know what they were really doing in that forest," she said, "before someone else goes missing." Asher moved beside her and sat. Quiet, still, but ready. Outside, the wind picked up again. The rain returned. And just beyond the trees, something watched. But this time, Mara wasn't afraid. She had a name. She had the truth. And she had a dog who never forgot. The day began with fog clinging low across the field, a white hush that muffled sound and distorted sight. Mara had just opened the kitchen door when she saw him. Asher, motionless near the garden's edge, his body half curled, limbs twitching. She didn't scream. Not right away. Some instinct, old and primal, locked her throat. Her breath caught as her legs moved on their own, sprinting toward the dog who had slept outside her door for weeks like a silent sentinel. "Asher." Her voice cracked, thin with fear. "No, no." His chest rose, shallow and jagged. His gums were pale. A trail of saliva clung to his lip, and something foamed at the edge of his mouth. His eyes flickered dull, unfocused, as if caught in some place between memory and collapse. Ewan was already on his feet by the time she shouted again. "Dad, it's Asher. He poisoned." Ewan didn't ask questions. He grabbed the med kit they'd kept stored under the stairs since Afghanistan. The same one with the old combat stims, charcoal packets, and emergency injectors Reed used to pack for K-9 field units. The two of them knelt beside Asher. Mara's hands trembled, stroking his fur, murmuring his name again and again like prayer. Ewan ran a gloved finger across the dog's tongue, then sniffed. Meat laced with something, probably a neurotoxin. Fast-acting, but not instant. He unzipped the field bag. His hands were steady in a way that made Mara both afraid and grateful. Like he'd done this before. Like he'd expected it. "Hold his head," Ewan said sharply. "If he convulses, I need a clear line to his airway." She nodded and obeyed, crouching low, cupping Asher's jaw between both palms. Asher didn't fight. He just stared at her. That same old haunted gaze. Ewan drew a syringe filled with a thick black liquid and plunged it into Asher's hind leg. The dog jerked once, breath hitching at his throat. "Activated charcoal concentrate. It'll buy us time." And Mara blinked through tears. "You knew this would happen." "I hoped it wouldn't," Ewan said, pressing another needle into a vein in Asher's front leg. "But Reed trained every K-9 handler for worst-case scenarios. What kind of person tries to kill a dog? One who knows the dog remembers." The words landed heavy, like truth too long denied. Mara looked down again. This was Trent. Ewan didn't reply, but his silence said everything. Asher trembled, his body slick with sweat and shivering. But then slowly, almost imperceptibly, his breathing steadied. The flutter behind his ribs calmed. Ewan wiped his brow with a shaking hand. He's fighting it. He's not out of the woods, but he's holding on. Mara sank to her knees, wrapping her arms gently around Asher's neck, whispering into his ear, "You don't get to leave. Not now. Not when we've come this far. Asher closed his eyes, leaning into her hand as though it was the only anchor he trusted. They carried him inside on a sheet between them, laying him in the corner of the living room beside the fireplace. Ewan lit the fire low and steady. Mara didn't leave his side, not for the next 6 hours. She kept a wet cloth on his head, read the names on the documents again, traced the coded messages Reed had left behind, but mostly, she watched him, watched his chest rise and fall, watched the twitch of his ears as he drifted in and out of sleep. By dusk, Asher stirred, weakly, but with purpose. His nose lifted slightly, catching the air. Ewan knelt beside him again. "You're not done, old boy," he murmured. "Reed knew that. He must have told you something, showed you something." Asher's paw twitched, dragging slightly across the wooden floor, toward the front door. Mara looked up. "He wants out. He needs to rest." But Asher tried again, not with strength, but insistence. Something in him reaching. Mara opened the door. The night had settled, thick with pine smoke and mist. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called. Asher didn't rise, but his gaze fixed on the darkness. He knew where the next piece of the puzzle was buried. Ewan stepped outside. After a moment, he crouched beside a patch of disturbed soil just beyond the porch. He reached down and picked up something small, wrapped in butcher paper. Inside, a hunk of raw meat, still damp. The edge of it glistened with a greenish tint. He turned it over and found a scrap of paper tucked beneath the twine. One less mouth, one less memory. Ewan folded the note tightly, jaw clenched. When he walked back inside, he didn't say a word. Mara didn't need him to. She stood up, moved toward Asher, and knelt again. "You held on because you knew we still needed you," she whispered. "You're not just a witness. You're the last thread." Emsley. She pressed her forehead gently to his, and for the first time, Asher wagged his tail, just once. But it was enough. The attic had always held a certain hush to it, not silence, but the kind of quiet that remembered voices. Dust motes floated like ash through beams of afternoon light as Mara eased open the old cedar chest. The hinges groaned softly, as if reluctant to reveal what had long been buried. She hadn't been up here in years. Her mother's handwriting still labeled most of the boxes, Neat, cursive, faded now, but still legible. Winter coats, baby clothes, cassettes, music plus field notes. That last one caught her eye. She reached in and drew out a small box covered in yellowed contact paper, edges curling. Tucked beneath a layer of sheet music was something heavier, cold to the touch. An old handheld tape recorder. Metal casing. The kind her mom used to carry during her research trips, back when she worked with field journalists and academic observers. Mara pressed the play button, but it only whirred, empty. She turned the recorder over and spotted a tape already inside, half wound. A strip of masking tape labeled in black marker. For her if I'm not back. Her fingers trembled. She didn't sit down. Just stood there, heart thudding, as she clicked it shut and hit play. The sound crackled. Then her mother's voice, low, focused, quieter than Mara remembered. If you're hearing this, I guess I didn't make it to the drop. The breath caught in Mara's chest. There's a man you already know his name, Trent Corrick. You think he owns land, but what he really owns is silence. The sheriff works for him. So do half the contractors out by the camp. The tape hissed softly between her mother's words. We were supposed to testify, Reed and I, but the files went missing. Then the threats came. And then Asher disappeared. Or so we thought. A pause. A breath that sounded like it had cost everything. I tried to protect you, baby. I tried to keep all of this away from the house. But it followed us. Because it never left. Because it's buried here, under our skin, under the town. Mara knelt slowly, holding the recorder in both hands, like a fragile relic. The voice had changed, not just in pitch, but in something deeper. A breaking edge. Don't trust the sheriff. If he asks about this, you say you know nothing. Not yet. Not until you've seen what Asher remembers. Another breath, then a whisper. If something happens to me, the truth is in Asher's eyes. The tape clicked softly as it stopped. Mara stayed still for a long while. Downstairs, the fire crackled. A clock ticked. Somewhere beyond the walls, wind curled through branches, carrying the faint sound of leaves rattling like secrets. She rewound the tape and played it again. Slower this time. Not with her ears, but with her soul. Every word wove itself around her ribs like thread pulling taut. Her mother hadn't died in an accident. She had been silenced, erased. And somehow, Asher had survived it all. Her eyes stung as she rose and descended the attic stairs. The living room was dim, the light low. Asher lay on the rug, wrapped in a blanket, eyes half-lidded. He lifted his head when she entered, weak still, but watching her, always watching. She sank beside him and placed the recorder on the floor between them. I heard her, Mara whispered. She trusted you, and you came back to find me. Asher blinked. Then slowly, he rested his chin on her knee. I don't know how to read your memories, she said, but I believe you remember, and I believe she was right. She pressed a hand to his chest. His heartbeat, faint but steady, answered her. Ewan stepped in from the hallway, drying his hands on a towel. His face was drawn, tired in that way that had nothing to do with sleep. You found something, he said softly. Mara looked up. She left a tape. His jaw clenched. I figured she might. She said not to trust the sheriff, and that Trent's fingerprints are everywhere. She was right, he said, voice hoarse. You knew. I knew parts, but I didn't want to pull you into that shadow. She's my mother, Dad. She didn't leave me behind. She left me a map. Ewan's eyes glistened. He nodded once, slowly. I'm ready to follow it, Mara said. A long pause stretched between them. Then, finally, Ewan crossed the room and sat beside them both. He reached out and rested a hand on Asher's head. The dog didn't flinch. We go forward, Ewan said. But we move quiet, because we're not just chasing truth anymore. Mara looked at him, puzzled. Then what? He met her eyes. We're threatening a man who thinks he's already buried it. Outside, thunder rolled low on the horizon, a slow, building promise. The forest didn't feel like it used to. There was a stillness now, the kind that crept into the bones and made you question every rustling leaf, every creak of bark. Mara stood at the edge of the clearing, one boot half buried in moss, watching her father kneel beside the broken stump where they'd left the decoy. The USB stick, not the real one. of course glinted faintly beneath a layer of damp pine needles, right where they wanted it to be. Half visible, half tempting, just enough to suggest a mistake. "You think he'll take the bait?" she asked. Ewan didn't look up. "If he thinks it's real, he'll come. He's too used to controlling the narrative." Mara shifted her weight, glancing behind her where Asher sat in the brush alert, quiet, eyes never leaving the perimeter. His fur had grown dull since the poisoning, but his gaze had not. It was as if the closer they got to the truth, the more he remembered. Ewan finished setting the trail camera motion activated, hidden in the hollow of a tree. The forest cabin loomed just beyond the clearing, abandoned again, but marked now with intent, as if it had chosen to bear witness. "You sure we're not walking into his trap instead of setting our own?" Mara said. Quieter now. Ewan stood and met her eyes. "It's always both." That night, they waited. Ewan insisted they return to the overlook, a ridge of stone and scrub just above the clearing, where the moonlight painted the trees in brittle silver. He brought binoculars. Mara brought the tape recorder, playing back her mother's voice again and again in her mind, like armor. Asher lay between them, head down but ears forward. Hours passed. The woods whispered. Then movement. Not loud, but intentional. A shadow moving against shadows. A man, tall, gloved, stepping from the trees with the ease of someone who'd done it many times before. He wore dark clothes, a scarf around the neck, and in his hand, not a flashlight, not a weapon, but a phone. He didn't approach the USB immediately. Instead, he circled, eyes scanning the tree line. He crouched and picked up a pine cone, rolled it in his palm like it meant something, then dropped it by the stump. Ewan tensed beside Mara. "He's sweeping for traps. M." Sure enough, the man Trent unmistakably reached into his coat and pulled out a small device, pointed it at the trees. "Infrared." "Damn it," Ewan muttered. "He's checking for cameras." Mara's heart pounded. "Can he detect ours?" "I insulated the lens, but if he gets too close." Trent stepped toward the hollow. Asher growled low, deep in his throat. Then abruptly Trent stopped. He knelt again, picked up the USB with 2 fingers and slipped it into a metal case from his pocket, clicked it shut, turned toward the woods. But he didn't leave. He looked up directly at the ridge. Right at them. Mara froze. "He sees us." "No," Ewan whispered. "He knew we'd be watching. He wants us to see him take it." And then Trent smiled. Just a flicker. Cold. Like a man who knew the end of a story before the first page had turned. He raised 2 fingers in a mock salute, then vanished into the trees without a sound. Mara's breath came shallow. "That wasn't bait." No," Ewan said, eyes dark. "That was a message." They descended from the ridge in silence. The clearing was untouched. No footprints, not with the moss so thick. The stump stood like an empty offering. Only one thing remained. The pine cone. The one he'd picked up. Ewan knelt beside it and turned it over, carved into its base with something sharp. "Next time, I won't miss." Mara stared at the words, as if they might rearrange themselves. Behind her, Asher stood suddenly, body stiff, ears pinned. A crack of sound from the woods. Then nothing. But they all knew what it meant. He'd come close enough to make his point. Ewan rose, face ashen. "We need to move the real files. He knows we have more than that stick." Mara swallowed hard. "He knows everything." "No," Ewan said, taking her by the shoulder, steadying her. "He thinks he does. That's his weakness." She looked at Asher. "And ours?" Ewan followed her gaze. The dog was still staring into the trees, where shadows bled into darker things. "Our weakness," Ewan said quietly, "is hoping the truth is enough to stop a man like him." Mara didn't respond. She already knew. Truth wasn't enough. But memory, the kind that never fades, never forgives, might be. The door was ajar. That was the first thing Ewan noticed when he stepped onto the porch, coffee still steaming in his hand, breath clouding in the early frost of morning. The door to Mara's room, wide open, not flung, not forced, just open. "Asher," he called out, voice unsure. No bark, no sound, just stillness thick enough to choke on. He stepped in fast now, dropping the mug where it shattered on the floor. "Mara?" Her bed was empty. Sheets half pulled. A sketchbook on the floor, pages torn. A single sock near the window. One of her boots still by the door. The other missing. And then the silence cracked. The thud behind him came fast. Boots, heavy, Trained. Ewan spun, but too late. A blow to the ribs, another to the back of the head. He crumpled. He remembered the metallic taste of blood, a glimpse of a man in black gloves, the weight of something cold pressed against his temple, then rope, then darkness. He came to hours later, arms tied behind him with coarse nylon, legs bound at the ankles. The living room was torn apart, cabinet drawers pulled, the war chest half open, but it was the silence that struck deepest. No sign of Asher, no sign of Mara, only a smear of muddy boot prints leading out the back door. In the forest, Asher moved like a ghost of himself. He limped. His body still bore the toll of the poison, and his breath came shallow in the cold. But his nose worked. It always had. The scent was sharp, not just of Mara, but of fear, of sweat and leather and oil, and something else beneath it. Rope, bondage. He stopped often, catching himself, muscles stiff. But he pushed forward, because dogs like Asher don't stop when they're hurt. They stop when they're dead. Snow crunched beneath his paws, light and fresh. It would cover the trail soon. The scent veered left, deeper into the timberline, where the light didn't reach, where human feet faltered, where secrets grew like rot. Asher growled low in his throat. He remembered this kind of path from another life. Back at the cabin, Ewan worked his wrists against the rope until blood came, until he could twist one hand free. He staggered upright, vision reeling, ribs screaming. But he didn't stop. He checked the wall, her pack gone. The note Trent had left before the pinecone message still sat on the windowsill like a dare, and beside it now, a new one, a sheet torn from Mara's sketchbook. 4 words in thick black marker. Should have stayed buried. Ewan clenched it in his fist. He didn't need to guess where she'd been taken. The forest knew, and so did the dog. Asher paused at the river crossing. The ice was thin. His paw broke through with a crack, and he pulled back, trembling. But the scent, her scent, crossed there. He paced once, twice, then stepped onto the ice. It groaned beneath his weight. A ripple of fractures laced across it like spider webs. He moved slow, paw by paw. When he reached the far bank, he collapsed briefly, chest heaving, but his eyes never stopped scanning the horizon. And then he heard it, a cry, faint, choked. Not a scream, just a muffled noise fear pressed into cloth. He knew it. Mara. Asher stood again, legs shaking, and began to run. Not fast, not strong, but forward. Mara struggled against the zip ties digging into her wrists. Her face was scraped where she'd been dragged through the underbrush. Her mouth still tasted of the dirty rag they'd stuffed in it. The cabin was old, musty. One of Trent's hidden spots, she guessed far from town. No windows, just wood, cold and rotting and full of dust. He hadn't spoken much, just stared at her with that smile. "I should have ended this when your mother opened her mouth," he'd said once, tapping a finger against the hilt of his knife. But she was sentimental, thought a child would keep secrets. Mara didn't speak. She just memorized the layout, the corners, the crack in the floorboard by her foot, the rusty nails in the beam behind her. She could wait. She could survive. She had to believe Asher would come. Because he always did. Because something in him remembered. Asher found the edge of the property by scent, a ring of gasoline and metal and blood, old blood, burned into the trees. He slowed now, tail low, nose twitching. He circled once, twice, then lay flat, crawling belly first through the underbrush, toward the scent that screamed the loudest. Mara. His ears perked. Inside the cabin, a soft shuffle, a stifled cough. Then a voice, "She's not your damn legacy, Reed." Asher's eyes narrowed. "That name!" Reed. A sound like fire tore through his chest. Memory flickered smoke, shouting boots and snow. And the voice, the man who walked away. Asher bared his teeth, every muscle trembling. He waited for the moon to rise just a little higher. Then he stood and began to circle the cabin. The hunt had begun. The camp wasn't marked on any map. It was tucked behind a dry creek bed, shrouded by pine and the smell of rot. A scattering of prefab buildings surrounded by fencing disguised as forestry maintenance. A makeshift sign read, "Green Hollow Youth Rehabilitation Center." But there were no children, no laughter, only silence, interrupted by the occasional crackle of a radio and the low growl of diesel engines running idle. Inside one of the windowless trailers, Mara sat cuffed to a metal chair. Her wrists ached. A single bulb buzzed overhead, swinging ever so slightly. The air was thick with ammonia and something worse, something sterile, like clinics that had long since lost their purpose. Trent's man had said nothing since they arrived, just stood in the corner, arms folded, watching her like she was already forgotten. But she hadn't screamed. She hadn't cried. She was her mother's daughter. And now she was Asher's, too. In the woods beyond the fence line, Asher crouched low, the moon casting fractured light over his back. His breath came in short bursts, nostrils twitching. From this distance, the camp looked calm, a line of white trailers and false security. But Asher could hear what the humans could not. The static of radios cycling on private channels, the metallic thunk of crates being loaded, the boots that never wandered far from their weapons. He crawled forward, finding the weak points the way he always had, silent, methodical, deliberate. Once, these were exercises done with Reed's hand on his collar. Now he worked alone, ghost-like, driven by instinct and memory. A guard stepped out to smoke. Asher moved. His shadow slipped behind a generator, paused, then darted to the next cover, the loading crate of an unmarked truck. Diesel fumes made the scent trail harder to follow, but not impossible. He knew Mara's scent like breath, like home. Another 10 paces, he was inside the fence. Mara lifted her eyes as the door creaked open. Trent entered, clean-shaven, unhurried. His coat was unzipped, revealing a sidearm and a bloodstain too small to be recent. "You've got your mother's look," he said almost kindly. That same foolish light in her eyes. Mara didn't answer. She just stared at him with that quiet steadiness, the kind that unnerved. "She tried to bring it all down, you know," he continued, pacing. "The whole operation. One photograph at a time. She thought telling the truth would matter, that the world cared about a few shipments going missing from a war no one even remembers." He leaned in, breath sour with smoke and power. "You've inherited her stubbornness, but not her reach." Then came the scream, sharp, distant, panicked. Trent turned. The door burst open again. A man rushed in, panting. "The dog's inside." Trent's jaw tightened. "What dog?" "The shepherd. It's here." K's bloomed like fire. Asher lunged from the shadows at the perimeter trailer, sinking his teeth into the thigh of a man holding a rifle. The scream echoed through the camp. Guards shouted. Lights snapped on. Flood lamps cut through the trees like blades. But Asher was already gone. He moved like a ghost on fire, weaving between legs, slamming bodies, dodging swings. He remembered how to disarm men, where to bite, when to release. He didn't kill, but he made sure they couldn't chase. At one point, he slid beneath a cargo crate and burst out the other side, catching the scent of Mara strong now, pure, undiluted. His legs burned. The old wound throbbed, but he did not stop. He never had. Inside the trailer, Trent grabbed Mara by the arm and yanked her up. "You've brought this on yourself." "I didn't bring anything," she spat. "He's not yours to command." Trent drew his gun, but in that split second the wall behind him shook. A thud, then a growl that didn't sound like it came from any earthly creature. And then Asher was through the door, blood on his fur, eyes locked on the man he remembered. The man who walked away in the smoke. For a moment, everything stilled. Then the gun raised. Mara shouted, "Asher!" But the dog didn't wait. He surged forward with a snarl, jaws wide. The shot went off, splintering the frame beside him, but Asher was already in the air, already colliding with Trent's chest. The gun skidded across the floor. Asher stood over him, snarling, teeth bared an inch from Trent's throat. Mara moved fast, grabbing the keys from the guard's belt, unlocking her cuffs with shaking fingers. "Asher," she whispered. The dog looked up at her. Just once. Then stepped back, letting Trent live barely. The man whimpered, scrambling against the wall. "You should run now," Mara said, her voice flat, "before he changes his mind." But Asher wasn't finished. He padded over to the desk, nose twitching. There in a drawer, another USB. And a folder. Inside, ledgers, manifest codes, photos, shipments marked as disposal. Dates, initials. The truth. All of it. Mara pocketed it. Then she looked at Asher. "Let's go home." He limped beside her, battered but unbroken. And behind them, the false camp began to fall apart, guards disarmed, alarms screaming, the first lights of justice flickering into dawn. The cabin sat on the ridge like an old scar wooden bones, sagging beneath snow-heavy shingles. A crooked chimney slumped against the sky. No trail marked the path here. No signs warned of danger. But Asher knew, and Mara followed him. She held her breath as they crept toward the porch. The boards groaned under her weight, but Asher moved like a whisper, his gait still uneven, his side bandaged hastily from the camp. The door hung slightly ajar. Inside, the dark breathed. "Asher," she whispered. "Are you sure?" He stopped. One paw lifted mid-step. Then the creak of a floorboard snapped the air. A voice followed, cold, dry. "I was wondering when you'd show up." Mara froze. Trent Corrick stepped from the shadows near the hearth, one hand wrapped around a pistol. He looked tired now. The lines of power around his mouth pulled tight with fury. "You just can't leave well enough alone, can you?" he said, raising the gun. "Just like your mother, M." Asher growled low, stepping in front of her. "Move, mutt," Trent said. The gun didn't waver, but Asher didn't move. His eyes locked on Trent's, like he was seeing something older than this moment, something buried in fire and betrayal. "You don't have to do this," Mara said softly. "You have no idea what's coming once the truth gets out." Trent laughed bitter, small. "Truth? No one cares. They never did. Your mother died for it. Reed died for it. And you think you'll be different?" She didn't answer. Her voice wouldn't come. Only Asher's growl deepened. Then Trent's hand tightened on the trigger, and everything slowed. The crack of the gunshot split the silence like lightning through dry air, sharp, final. But it didn't hit Mara. Asher had already leapt. The impact was sickening. His body collided with hers midair, knocking her backward as the bullet struck his shoulder, burrowing deep. He yelped. Not loud, not long, just one breath of pain. Then silence as he hit the floor between her and Trent. "No!" Mara screamed, scrambling to him. Asher twitched once. Blood bloomed across the bandage, crimson against gray. Trent moved forward, lifting the gun again. But a figure crashed through the back of the cabin before he could fire. Ewan. Eyes wild. Face bruised. Breath ragged from the sprint. He didn't hesitate. He tackled Trent like a wave breaking over stone, sending the pistol clattering across the wooden floor. The two men struggled fists, boots, curses until Ewan slammed Trent's head into the wall with a dull crack. Trent slumped, unconscious. Ewan stood over him, chest heaving. Mara barely noticed. She was on the ground, her hands pressing into Asher's fur, trying to staunch the bleeding with her scarf. "Stay with me," she whispered. "Please don't go." Asher blinked once, slow and deliberate. His tail thudded once against the wood, then stilled. Ewan dropped to his knees beside her, his face ashen. "He's breathing," he murmured, pressing his fingers gently to the dog's side. Shallow, but there. Mara let out a sob she didn't know she was holding. It cracked her in half. They worked in silence, tearing apart Trent's jacket to make another wrap, lifting Asher with every care a father and daughter could summon. Outside, the wind howled, but the snow had stopped. "I thought we'd lost him," she said, voice trembling. Ewan looked at her, not as a father looks at a child, but as a man looks at someone braver than himself. So did I. They left Trent cuffed with his own belt, bleeding but alive. Justice would come. But for now, they carried their fallen hero home, one step at a time, through woods that remembered everything. The wind had teeth that night, raking snow across cabin windows in silver ribbons. Inside, time shrank to the fragile rhythm of shallow breaths. Asher lay on the floor near the fire, fur matted with blood, a quilt folded beneath his flank. The bullet had ripped through muscle and bone. The bleeding had stopped, but the life inside him flickered. Each rise of his chest felt borrowed. Mara hadn't moved in hours. She knelt beside him, hand cradling his neck, the other pressing a towel to the wound. Her lips formed silent prayers that never quite reached sound. When his body twitched, hers twitched with it. "Come on," she finally whispered, barely air. "Don't leave me too." Across the room, Ewan paced near the wood stove, boots melting snow into muddy tracks. Blood still stained his nails despite scrubbing. A satellite phone buzzed in his palm. "Storms grounded the closest chopper in Bend," he said, voice raw. "Best they can promise is dawn." Mara didn't answer. "Asher's tough." Ewan tried again. "He survived worse." "No," she replied, eyes on the shepherd's half-closed gaze. "He hasn't." Ewan sank beside her, the walls shuddering, as wind wailed like grieving pines. He stared at the dog who had jumped between Mara and a gunman only hours earlier. "I used to think dogs like him were just tools," he admitted. "No heart, just muscle memory." His voice cracked. "But when I saw him take that hit, I knew I'd been wrong about everything." Mara leaned until her forehead touched Asher's. "I won't let him go, thinking he's alone." "He's not," Ewan vowed. "Not anymore." Heat from the stove cast restless shadows over Asher's flank, across the faded military tattoo half hidden by fresh bandages. Ewan rose, dug through the supply chest, and unwrapped a canvas field kit. "When Reed and I were at Camp Bishop," he said, "he showed me a last resort shock protocol. I thought it was too risky." He thumbed a small injector. "No choices left." Mara swallowed. "Will it hurt him?" "No more than dying." Ewan pressed the injector into a vein. A hiss. Nothing. Mara's silent sob cracked in the dim light. And then a ragged breath. Asher's paw twitched once, twice. Pulse faint but firmer. Ewan grabbed fresh towels, elevating the leg. He's not out of the woods, but he's not gone. Outside, the wind screamed one last time and fell into exhausted hush. Asher's ear flicked toward Mara's voice, as if to say, "I'm still here." By dawn, the storm ended, leaving the forest reborn under unbroken white. Inside, aftermath lay heavy. Mara sat on the bed, clutching her mother's silver locket, the one that had survived fires, staged accidents, and every lie Trent's criminal network had spun around Elderglen. She clicked it open. No photo greeted her, but a fingernail-sized micro SD card. A hidden confession. Across the room, Asher slept near the hearth, breathing steadier. Yet his ears tracked her every motion. "Mom left proof," Mara whispered, kneeling beside him. She slid the card into her battered laptop. A folder appeared. "For Ingrid, if I don't make it." Inside were audio logs, doctored manifests, surveillance photos, evidence of a weapons pipeline disguised as a rehab camp. Her mother's recorded voice spoke in hushed urgency. "If something happens to me, it won't be an accident. Trent's operation runs deeper than anyone knows. Reed found out, and they silenced him. If you're hearing this, Asher survived. Hope survived." Asher stirred at Reed's name. Mara clicked a video. Her mother in a windswept clearing, younger Asher at her side. "Tell my daughter I'm sorry I left so much unsaid and that the truth is in Asher's eyes." The screen went dark. Tears blurred Mara's vision. But she understood. Asher hadn't merely guarded them. He'd carried a legacy. "I get it now," she told him, fingers in his fur. His eyes opened, slow but lucid, tail thudding once. "I hear you. We still have time," she said. "We'll finish what you started." Ewan appeared in the doorway. One look at the laptop told him enough. "We send it to Ingrid. Go public." "End Trent," Mara said. "Then we finish this," he agreed. Outside, the wind carried away the last lie still standing. A helicopter's rotors shredded the morning quiet, swirling snow as medics rushed in. Mara cradled Asher during transfer, pressing Reed's old tag into his fur. "You kept your promise," she whispered. "Now let me keep mine." Asher met her gaze, no bark, just trust, as he vanished into the Medju chopper's metallic belly. The blades beat a vow into the sky. Federal agents, called by Ingrid's DC office, swept through the woods, seizing files, arresting Trent's men. The secret camp was no longer secret. Mara watched the horizon where the helicopter disappeared. "Do you think he'll make it?" she asked Ewan. "He's given everything," Ewan said quietly. "If he stops now, it won't be surrender. It'll be completion." Mara pulled out the locket, now filled with truth. "This has the evidence," she said, voice steady. "But Asher is the story." Then we make sure the world tells it right," Ewan replied. That afternoon, they waited in a Milltown veterinary trauma center that smelled of antiseptic and thawing coats. A television blared breaking news. Federal agents, spurred by evidence from whistleblower Nora Hale's daughter and a missing action K-9 named Asher, have dismantled a covert weapons pipeline. They were saying his name on television. Mara's eyes filled. "They won't forget you again," she whispered to the empty air, and to every forgotten service dog who had ever slipped into silence. A door opened. The attending vet, exhaustion etched into his face, pulled down his mask. "He's stable," he announced. "Still critical, but if he survived that flight, he's a fighter." Mara closed her eyes and, for the first time since the wind found its teeth, allowed herself to believe in tomorrow. Somewhere down the hall, a German shepherd beat his tail weak but certain against a metal cage, holding the world's attention one breath at a time. And outside, the forest stood silent, waiting for spring. The morning sun filtered gently through the sycamore trees lining Main Street, casting long golden slats across the sidewalks of Elderglen. For the first time in a long time, the town didn't feel like it was holding its breath. Windows were open, flags weren't lowered, and children walked to school again, backpacks bouncing, mittens swinging at their sides. Mara stood at the front steps of Elderglen High, her breath misting in the cool March air. Her hair was longer now, pulled into a loose braid, strands of it catching the light. The scar near her collarbone from that winter night had faded into a thin reminder beneath her shirt. She paused before the doors, letting the morning settle over her like a quiet promise. Then she walked inside. The hallway chatter stopped, not in judgment this time, but something softer. Eyes turned, but they didn't narrow. A few boys dipped their heads. A girl she barely knew smiled as she passed. Respect. It was a strange new weight on her shoulders, gentler than fear, but heavier in its own way. People didn't just look at her anymore as the girl whose mom vanished, or Ewan's strange daughter with the old dog. Now, she was the girl who stood her ground, who uncovered the truth, who walked back from the woods with blood on her sleeves and justice in her hands. And in their eyes, she hadn't done it alone. Outside of town, the so-called rehabilitation camp was now nothing but an empty lot guarded by yellow tape and federal signs. The buildings had been torn down in January. Trenches filled in. The snow had melted off the grounds weeks ago, leaving behind soft earth and a scattering of birdseed laid down by volunteers, hoping the land might learn to host gentler things again. Trent Holbrook was awaiting sentencing in a federal facility, denied bail on every count: racketeering, smuggling, obstruction of justice, tampering with classified military operations. A man once considered the untouchable spine of Elderglen now had his name reduced to case files and prison numbers. And no one spoke his name in public anymore, not in fear, but in shame. Ewan spent his days rebuilding the shed. Not because he had to, but because his hands needed something to do. He kept it simple. No locks, no surveillance this time. Just a new roof, fresh lumber, and a small bench out front where Asher liked to nap. Asher, now slowly recovering, was back to walking short distances. His gait was still uneven, and he tired easily, but he was eating again, responding to his name, barking, sometimes, at passing squirrels like he had unfinished business to remind them of. The vet said the bullet missed his heart by inches. The scar it left behind would be permanent. But so was the way he looked at Mara now, a little slower, a little older, but never without that flicker of knowing. "You saved me," she told him once, kneeling beside his bed the week he came home. But he'd only blinked, as if to say, "You brought me back." That evening, Mara stood by the fence at the edge of their yard, notebook tucked beneath her arm. The horizon burned soft gold above the hills, the wind carrying scents of pine and distant rain. Behind her, Ewan was sitting in the doorway of the rebuilt shed, sharpening an old pocket knife, not to use just a ritual, something to pass the time. Asher lay beside him, his head resting on Ewan's boot, eyes half closed. "You okay?" Ewan asked without looking up. "Yeah," Mara replied, "just watching the light." There was a long silence, and then she added, "It doesn't feel heavy anymore." Ewan finally looked at her, the girl who had grown up in the shadow of silence, and somehow turned it into truth. "No," he said, "it doesn't." She turned, walking back to the porch, and sat beside Asher, resting her hand lightly against the curve of his ribs. What now? She asked softly, unsure if she was asking the dog, her father, or herself. Ewan leaned back in his chair. Now? You go to school? You live? You write, if that's what you still want? She nodded. It is. And him? He gestured toward Asher. He stays, she said. Always. In the weeks to come, letters arrived from veterans groups. Reporters called. A national rescue organization reached out, offering to fund Asher's full rehabilitation and proposed honoring him at an upcoming ceremony in D.C. But Mara said no, not because she didn't think he deserved it, but because she knew Asher didn't need medals or cameras. What he needed, what he'd always needed, was quiet, a soft porch, a family who saw the scars and still called him whole. And now, he had that. The pine still stood at the edge of the property older than the war, older than the town's memory. Its bark was blackened in some places from lightning long ago, but it endured, needles whispering in the wind like a language only time could translate. Beneath its outstretched limbs was a shrine, modest, almost hidden if you didn't know where to look. A small stone marker rested there, etched by hand. No grand words, just K9 Asher. He came back. Next to it was a worn collar, not the tactical one, but the first one Mara had bought him after that winter, blue with a single silver tag. It no longer fit around his neck. He had thickened with rest and age, the bulk of muscle softening into something more lived in. But she left it there, beneath the pine, where he used to stand for hours unmoving, like a sentinel from another world. The ground there had been disturbed, not by burial, but by memory. Mara had scattered a handful of ash, not his, thank God, but from the remains of the old shed where everything had once unraveled. It was symbolic, closure, not grief. That patch of earth had become something sacred now. Not because he died, but because he hadn't. Most mornings, Asher lay curled on the porch, one ear slightly bent, the other still twitching at distant sounds. His body bore the long road back a limp in his right hind leg, a dull haze in his left eye from the blast years before. But he was no ghost. He watched Mara now the way he always had, not to guard, but to understand. There was no more flinching when a car backfired, no more pacing during storms. He no longer needed to be told it was over. He knew. She had changed, too. She no longer carried that look, the one that said she was bracing for someone to disappear. Her shoulders rested easier now. Her laughter, rare as it was, came quicker. In the evenings, she read aloud to him, her voice low, rhythmic, her fingers sometimes pausing to scratch behind his ear. Old books. Her mother's journals. Even just grocery lists. It wasn't the words that mattered, it was the ritual, the presence. They didn't need conversation to feel understood. They never had. One afternoon, Ewan joined her on the porch. He brought coffee and a folded newspaper, the way he always did, pretending not to read the headlines about himself, about the testimony he'd given, about the town finally rebuilding its trust. Mara was sitting cross-legged on the steps, drawing quietly in her sketchpad. Asher lay beside her, tail thumping once every now and then when her foot brushed him. "Mind if I sit?" Ewan asked. Though he didn't wait for a yes, she nodded, offering him a half smile. "You already did," he chuckled. "Can't argue that." They sat in silence for a while, the wind shifting through the pine, birds moving low across the fields, a tractor humming far in the distance. "Place feels different now," Ewan finally said. "It is. Because of you." She didn't answer right away. Her pencil paused midline, hovering just above the paper. "I think it was always like this," she said at last. "We just didn't know how to see it." Asher lifted his head slightly, eyes settling on her face, as if echoing the thought. She reached down and brushed the fur along his neck. "That soft place where strength met surrender." "He still checks the fence line in the mornings," Ewan said. "I know, even though he's not supposed to." Mara smiled. "It's not about supposed to. It's about who he is." Ewan nodded slowly. "Just like your mom." The next day, she added something to the shrine, a small photograph, laminated in glass. It was old, worn, creased at the corners. Her mother in uniform smiling with her hand on a younger Asher's harness. Reed was beside her, holding the leash. Both were sunburnt, tired. But their eyes held something unbreakable. She set the photo just beneath the stone marker, then stepped back. Asher had followed her out, slower now but still steady. He settled beside the pine with a quiet sigh and lowered himself down, resting his head against the earth where memory lingered. Mara knelt and looked at him. "You're not forgotten," she whispered. And somewhere in the hush of branches overhead, it felt like the past nodded. That night, as the porch light buzzed and moths danced in its glow, Asher remained outside long after Mara had gone in. He lay facing the field, ears still trained on the invisible sounds of the world. Not guarding anymore, just remembering. And for the first time in a long time, he blinked slowly, let the wind pass over him, and finally peacefully closed both eyes. The statue wasn't grand. It didn't tower or gleam. No ribbon-cutting ceremony, no brass band. Just a quiet unveiling on a late autumn morning in Elderglen Square, where the sun filtered gently through thinning branches and the air carried the scent of pine and old stories. It stood no taller than a bench the statue cast in bronze, with the greenish patina of time already setting in. A German shepherd, seated but alert, one paw slightly lifted as if mid-step, mid-thought, mid-remembering. The detail was remarkable. The curve of the ears, the scar across the muzzle, the posture equal parts strength and surrender. But it was the eyes that stopped people in their tracks. They weren't heroic. They were human. The plaque at the base read simply, K9. Asher he remembered what we forgot. No rank, no date, just the name and the truth. Mara stood a few feet back, her hand curled around the old tag she'd kept tucked inside her jacket pocket. It was worn now, edges dulled, lettering faded, but she could still make out the shape of his name, engraved long ago by someone who understood that names aren't just identifiers. They're anchors. She closed her fingers around it, thumb brushing the metal as if it were skin. Asher lay nearby, not at attention, but not asleep either. His body was slower now, the recovery long and imperfect, but he was here, present, breathing. And beside, the statue meant to honor his memory while he was still alive to see it. A few townsfolk had gathered. Not many, just those who knew. Those who had whispered thanks in grocery aisles or left flowers outside their gate when no one was looking. Veterans with ball caps tucked low. Children who now pointed and said, "That's the dog I told you about." Someone had brought folding chairs. Someone else had set up coffee on a folding table. No speeches were planned. Still, the silence said more than words could. Ewan approached, a mug in each hand. His coat was buttoned crookedly, one sleeve still stained with oil from fixing the truck that morning. He nodded toward the statue. They got the eyes right. Mara smiled faintly. "I know." He handed her a mug. She didn't drink, just held it, the warmth sinking into her palms. "He still checks the window every morning," she said. "Looking for ghosts?" "No," she said, "looking to make sure they're gone." They both looked toward Asher then, who was watching a child tug on his mother's hand, asking to pet the real dog, not just the statue. The mother hesitated, then knelt to whisper something. The child approached slowly, palm open. Asher tilted his head, then lifted that same paw, the one immortalized in bronze, and placed it gently on the child's shoe. The boy beamed. Mara's breath caught. For a moment, she couldn't speak. She reached into her coat and pulled out the tag again. "I want to leave it," she said quietly. Ewan frowned. "You sure?" She nodded. "It belongs here now." She stepped toward the statue, careful not to disturb the moment between boy and dog. At the base, just beneath the plaque, someone had tucked a pine branch. Mara knelt and gently tied the tag to it with a bit of ribbon she'd carried in her pocket blue, like the first collar Asher ever wore when he came home. She touched the tag one last time, then stood and smiled. Later that evening, as the square emptied and dusk softened the edges of everything, Asher remained curled at the foot of the statue. He didn't whine, didn't pace, just rested, ears turning now and then at passing sounds, footsteps, wind, the low creak of an old flagpole nearby. Mara sat on the bench across from him, sketchpad balanced on her knees. She wasn't drawing the statue, she already had that memorized. Instead, she drew the boy, the expression, the way Asher's paw had landed so gently. She was trying to capture the in-between space, that breath of trust before connection. "You think he knows?" she asked softly, more to herself than anyone else. Ewan had joined her again, sipping from a thermos this time. "Knows what?" "That it's him up there. That it's for him." Ewan glanced at the statue, then at Asher. "I think he knows it's for all of them." She nodded. Then I'm glad we didn't wait until he was gone. Night settled gently. The stars came early this time of year, clear and sharp in the mountain air. Porch lights flickered on in the houses nearby. The wind turned colder. Mara stood, stretched, and walked toward Asher. "Time to go home, old man." He blinked at her, yawned, and rose. Slower now, stiffer, but still with that steady rhythm in his step like music only he could hear. They walked together, one girl, one dog, and a town that finally remembered what mattered. And behind them, beneath the pine-shaped shadows and street lamp glow, the statue watched in silence. Not mourning, not warning, just remembering. Stories like Asher's remind us why dogs, especially German shepherds, are more than companions. They're protectors of our quietest truths. Their loyalty isn't loud, but it's unshakable. They don't ask for praise, yet they show up in our darkest hours, holding steady when everything else falls apart. If you've ever looked into your dog's eyes and felt understood without a single word, you know exactly what I mean. If this story stirred something in you, maybe it's time to deepen that connection, to listen a little more closely, to walk a little slower, to learn something new about the soul resting beside your chair. I found a resource recently that's helped me do just that, a gentle guide to understanding our dogs, not just as pets, but as the quiet guardians they are. If you're curious, I'll leave it here for you to explore in your own time. Thank you for spending this story with me. And give your dog a little extra love. Tonight they always know when it matters most.